I'm a 35-year-old male beef and dairy farmer. I raise cows and sell them to producers. Contrary to popular belief, I spend most of my time working the fields and taking care of the farm instead of the animals because the farm provides food for them. Oddly enough, I can't stand to eat beef. Even just seeing it makes my skin crawl. I know it sounds strange, but let me explain. I had hired some contractors to expand into the forest, and I thought it was going to be all fine. But one day, my tractor broke down in the middle of a long stretch of road. It was around dusk, so I wanted to get moving as quickly as possible before the animals woke. So there I was, looking through the tractor's engine to see what had gone wrong. Turns out the serpentine belt had broken. Damn, I don't have a replacement for me. I sigh and try pulling out my phone. While twiddling with the buttons, I felt a weight on my shoulder. "Hello there, partner. I think this might be helpful." The voice was low and grainy like someone who had just woken up. I turn around to see a flat-faced man holding a slip belt perfect for the tractor. I accept his aid and take a better look at him. However, the sun shining behind him blinds me, silhouetted like a shade blending into the darkened tree lines. Word of advice. Friend, you should give up your intrusion into the forest. He begins to push past me and walk past my tractor, just outside of my view. I'm able to catch a glimpse of what he's wearing. A long dark shawl decorated with what looks to be a million eyes. Give up before you wake the beast. Haul up, partner. Roll that back a minute. What are you talking about? I walk around the corner of the tractor to glimpse him. Nothing but still air. Later that day, I received a call that the contractors had found a small marsh of sticky black tar filled with a number of animal skeletons. The farm has always been quiet at night. All the farmhands leave to go home, and it's just me and the barn. My part of the country doesn't have many criminals, and most steer clear of cattle farmers because there isn't much worth stealing. I jolted awake one night. I could hear the distant sound of my cows in distress. A dozen guttural cries layered on top of each other. It's hard to express what the sound was. It was an octave lower than what cattle typically sound like. I shuffled onto my feet and grabbed my shotgun. Usually, I'm not too distressed about these things. Most of the time, it's just a sickly cow passing or one of the pregnant ones giving birth. However, I never found there to be any cows in such a condition. I was worrying. What if a thief had gotten in, or worse, a bear? The closer I got to the barn, the more I picked up on the small sounds around me. The sound from the barn grew louder. A small whisper in the distance turned into a roaring cacophony. My head felt like it was going to spill out of my skull, but then I noticed something odd. The dull pitter-patter of hooves on dry ground was missing. I inched closer to the barn. My legs felt like a pair of stilts 1,000 miles tall. My shotgun weighed down in my arms, and I could feel the cold steel of the barrel pressing into my arm as I readied to enter the barn. I adjusted it in my hand, feeling the texture of the barrel. Smooth, finely machined steel ran across its length, interrupted by pure sandpaper. I hadn't needed to take the weapon out often, so it had grown weak. I could only really shoot it twice. The hinges had rusted over a while ago, and I hadn't fought to get it maintained. I swallowed as I pushed into the barn. It felt like a mouse passing through the inside of a snake. I entered the barn quietly. I had left the door open, and a light shaft cast through the barn. The light bounced off the floor, faintly illuminating the forms of the barn from underneath. It was bright enough to make out the space vaguely. I was so caught up in my anxieties that I hadn't noticed the barn had gone quiet. Is anyone there? Salam. Silence. No more light except for crooked lines of moonlight slithering into the barn, jagged and broken. Dozens of unaware black eyes stared back at me. The cows were fine, some awake, others asleep, all in order. This can't be right. Where's the bear? The thief. There has to be something in here. I aimed the gun and scanned the barn from corner to corner. Pieces of hay crunched under my weight as I walked through the barn. I scanned each of the pens, cows, bulls, and calves. I felt a jitter in my spine. Usually, one or two would swing their tail or eat a bale of hay, but they sat there ghost still, posed as if ready for a picture. A shadow passed through the gaps of light. I'm armed, and I will shoot if you don't give up peacefully. Still nothing. I could hear the fluid in my ears sloshing around. The cold air was stagnant. My face stung from the chill, and my nose picked up on something, a bitter smell, almost like rotting meat. I inched closer to the smell, scuttling. 1,000 hooves on the hardwood. A shadow shifted through the forms. The guttural screaming of 1,000 cows began once more. The cattle were still stiff, almost like they couldn't hear it. Distorted and low, snorting and growling. It was the war cry of a great army bearing down on me. I inched away, my gun ready. I was prepared to shoot. A long shadow cut through the splintered light. The silhouette of a great bull cast itself on the wall of the barn. Leave! A low growl echoed in my skull, sounding like it passed through thin metal. My gut twisted into a knot, and the walls felt like they shot out in odd angles, pitching and rotating with wild abandon. It was like the barn was melting around me. My fingers twitched. Bang! The many-horned heads turned up at attention. Madness. The cattle were running into the walls, injuring each other in the chaos. However, they were trapped in their pens. My head was about to pop off, and the world was closing in. Madness. Sheer cacophony. I leaned against the wall and looked forward. A form emerged from the shrieking mass. It was approaching. As it got closer, I flinched instinctively. 2 piercing red eyes were looking back at me. White-hot anger. The shotgun weighed 1,000 pounds. I shifted its weight, gasping as I tried to keep my arms straight. Bang! The barrel was aimed directly at it, still approaching. Click, click, click. What the oh no? My legs toppled. I tried to pull myself up, but they won't work. I felt a warm, wet breath on my face. It was inches away from me. Cud curdled in my throat. The smell of pure sulfur violated my nose, and before I could react, I was hurled backward, landing hard in the dirt with a mouthful of grass. Dazed, I looked up to see the barn looming over me from the outside. I had no room to question the voice. Whatever thing could do those things wasn't human, nor was it an animal, and I wanted no part of it. I sold the farm that same month and moved into the city to work as a gardener. Agriculture skills are surprisingly transferable to gardening. I don't miss the farm. But sometimes, when driving through the countryside late at night, I swear I see a pair of red eyes glowing in the distance, watching, waiting. Room 7 looked like any other motel room. It wasn't. The drive was supposed to be easy. I'd been feeling restless for a while, even though my travel blog was doing well. Traveling and writing had become repetitive, and I felt like I was just going through the motions. I missed the thrill of finding new places and the sense of adventure that made me start the blog in the first place. Lately, everything felt forced, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important. I remembered when every trip felt like a real adventure, like the time I found a hidden village in the mountains or met a kind stranger who showed me a secret spot only locals knew about. Those moments used to fill me with excitement, but now everything felt dull. I needed something to remind me why I loved traveling, like when I found that hidden waterfall in Oregon, or camped under the stars in the desert. I wanted that feeling of wonder again. Driving from Chicago to Denver was supposed to help clear my mind. But as the miles went by, everything looked the same. Flat farmland that stretched forever. The monotony of the endless road was almost hypnotic, and I still felt lost and uninspired. It was like I was running away from something but didn't know what, and nothing I found along the way seemed to fill the emptiness. Then I found Council Bluffs. It felt different, almost like I was meant to stop there. The streets were unusually empty, and the buildings looked old and forgotten, like time had stopped. There was an eerie stillness in the air that made me shiver, like something was watching me from the shadows. Council Bluffs was on the border between Iowa and Nebraska, next to the Missouri River. It had a simple charm, a gas station, An old diner that looked like it was from the 1950s and a small church. Something about it made me curious, like there was more beneath the surface waiting to be discovered. The motel I found was called the Silver Rest Inn. It was right off the main road and looked old and run down. The paint was peeling, and the old neon sign flickered as the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. It was the kind of place people only used to sleep before moving on, and I figured it would be good enough for 3 nights. As I parked my car, I felt the temperature drop suddenly, and I thought I heard a faint creaking sound, like an old door swinging in the wind. It made me uneasy. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, and my stomach twisted with worry. I tried to ignore it and grabbed my bag, heading into the front office. The room smelled like dust and something metallic that I couldn't quite place. Behind the counter was an old man with tired eyes. He nodded at me and spoke in a rough voice. "Need a room?" he asked. "Yeah, for 3 nights, please," I said, smiling even though I felt a bit uncomfortable. He hesitated for a moment, then handed me an old key with a wooden tag. "Room 7, he said. He paused, looking serious. "There are a few rules you need to follow." I raised an eyebrow. "Rules?" He nodded and pushed a small, yellowed piece of paper across the counter. The ink was smudged like it had been written a long time ago. "It's nothing too serious," he said, but I could hear the unease in his voice. "Just things to keep in mind." I took the note and looked at it. It had 5 rules. Always close the bathroom door before sleeping, even if the light is off. Do not open the window after 10 o'clock p.m., even if it gets hot. If you hear knocking, check the peephole first. Do not open the door if no one is there. At midnight, place a cup of water on the nightstand, and do not drink it. On your last night, leave a coin on the bedside table before you go to bed. A shiver ran through me. Is this some kind of local superstition? I asked, trying to sound amused, though my voice was shaky. The old man's smile faded, and he looked at me seriously. "Just follow the rules. Room 7. It's different." I wanted to ask more, but the way he looked at me made me stop. Instead, I nodded and took the key and the note. "Okay, I'll follow them," I said, trying to sound casual. The room was at the far end of the motel, and the door looked worn from years of use. I turned the key in the lock, and the door opened with a heavy click. The room was what I expected: a bed with an old floral bedspread, a small wooden table, and a bathroom with a chipped mirror. The air was a bit stale, so I walked over to the window and pulled the curtains aside to let in some fresh air. Outside, everything was quiet, with only the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. I looked at the note again, feeling a strange sense of worry. It was just a room, I told myself. I had stayed in plenty of rooms like this, but I couldn't shake the look in the old man's eyes. It was like he was warning me. The air felt heavy, and I could swear I heard a faint rustle, like something moving in the shadows, making my skin prickle. The first night, I ignored the rules. I left the bathroom door slightly open, even though I felt a shiver telling me I shouldn't. What harm could it cause? I got ready for bed, feeling exhausted from the long drive. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and as I lay there, I couldn't help but think about the strange rules. The unease lingered, making it hard to fully relax. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I fell asleep. I woke up at 3 o'clock a.m. The room was dark, but something felt wrong. The air was damp, like just before a storm. I looked at the bathroom, and my heart skipped a beat. The door, which I had left partly open, was now wide open. The darkness inside seemed to move, almost like it was alive. My heart started to race, and then I heard it, a deep growl coming from the bathroom, like an animal in pain. Fear took over, and I forced myself to move. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, the floor cold beneath my feet. I crept toward the bathroom, my heart pounding in my ears. The growl stopped as soon as I touched the door, and I quickly pushed it shut, locking it. I looked through the peephole, but there was nothing, just darkness. The knocking continued, getting louder and louder, echoing in the small room. I backed away, my gaze darting to the open window. The curtains moved with the breeze, and I rushed over to close the window. As soon as it was shut, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost scarier than the knocking. My hands were shaking, and I stood there, trying to make sense of it. There had been no one there, but the knocking and footsteps were real. I rushed to close the window, but it was like something invisible was pushing against it, making it almost impossible to move. I struggled with all my strength, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until finally, with a surge of effort, I managed to close it. Suddenly, the bathroom door burst open, and what seemed like an obscure creature on four legs lunged out. It looked like a twisted, shadowy animal. Its body was long and skeletal, with jagged, bony legs that ended in sharp, claw-like points. Its face was featureless, a black void that seemed to absorb the light around it. My heart stopped as it came at me, and I closed my eyes, bracing for impact. But then, nothing. The sudden silence was deafening, as if the entire room had been swallowed by emptiness. I felt a strange, hollow stillness, like the world itself had paused. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone, as if it had never been there. I collapsed onto the bed, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. I felt like I was losing my mind. I picked up the note again, and the words seemed even more important now. These weren't just silly superstitions. They were rules meant to keep me safe from forces beyond my comprehension. I stood there, breathing hard, waiting for any other sound. But the room was silent again, and slowly the damp feeling in the air went away. I climbed back into bed, pulling the covers tightly around me, keeping my eyes on the bathroom door, until I finally fell asleep. My dreams were uneasy, filled with fleeting images of shadows moving across the walls and whispering voices I couldn't understand. Every time I thought I was about to make out the words, I would wake up in a sweat, only to find the room quiet and still. The next morning, I tried to shake off the fear from the night before. Maybe I hadn't closed the door properly, and the strange growl could have just been the wind or old pipes. I didn't want to think too much about it, so I spent the day exploring Council Bluffs. I took pictures of the Union Pacific Railroad Museum, the old squirrel cage jail, and the Missouri River. The town was quiet and had a sort of eerie beauty to it. People were polite but not very friendly, and they seemed to look at me strangely when I mentioned the motel. "You're staying at the Silver Rest Inn?" the waitress at the diner asked, her smile fading. "Yeah," I said, trying to act normal. "Why? Is there something I should know?" She hesitated, then looked around like she wanted to make sure no one else heard. "Just follow the rules," she said quietly. "People who don't, well, they are never found again." A shiver ran through me. Something about the way she said it made me feel like I was already in danger, like there was some dark secret everyone in the town knew but wouldn't share with outsiders. That night, back in room 7, I made sure to follow the first rule. I closed the bathroom door firmly before getting into bed. I looked over the list again, my eyes lingering on the second rule. Do not open the window after 10 o'clock p.m., even if it gets hot. The room felt stuffy. The air conditioner rattled, but it wasn't doing much to cool the room. By 11 o'clock p.m., I was sweating and my shirt stuck to my skin. I knew what the note said, but no matter how hard I tried, I felt like I couldn't breathe, like something was very wrong with my throat. I walked over to the window and opened it, letting the cool night air in. The breeze felt amazing, and I sighed with relief. But then I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel outside the door. Slow and deliberate. My whole body tensed up. The footsteps got louder, and then there was a soft knock at the door. Then another, louder this time, like whoever it was wanted to be let in. My heart pounded as I crept towards the door, my eyes on the peephole. I looked through the peephole, but there was nothing, just darkness. The knocking continued, getting louder and louder, echoing in the small room. I backed away, my gaze darting to the open window. The curtains moved with the breeze, and I rushed over to close the window. As soon as it was shut, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was almost scarier than the knocking. My hands were shaking, and I stood there, trying to make sense of it. There had been no one there, but the knocking and footsteps were real. I rushed to close the window, but it was like something invisible was pushing against it, making it almost impossible to move. I struggled with all my strength, my breath coming in ragged gasps, until finally, with a surge of effort, I managed to close it. Suddenly, the bathroom door burst open, and what seemed like an obscure creature on 4 legs lunged out. It looked like a twisted, shadowy animal. Its body was long and skeletal, with jagged, bony legs that ended in sharp, claw-like points. Its face was featureless, a black void that seemed to absorb the light around it. My heart stopped as it came at me, and I closed my eyes, bracing for impact. But then, nothing. The sudden silence was deafening, as if the entire room had been swallowed by emptiness. I felt a strange, hollow stillness, like the world itself had paused. When I opened my eyes, the creature was gone, as if it had never been there. I collapsed onto the bed, my heart pounding painfully in my chest. I felt like I was losing my mind. I picked up the note again, and the words seemed even more important now. These weren't just silly superstitions. They were rules meant to keep me safe from forces beyond my comprehension. That night, sleep did not come easily. Every small sound seemed amplified: the creak of the bed, the rustle of the curtains. I kept my eyes fixed on the bathroom door, half expecting it to swing open again. When I finally drifted off, my dreams were filled with dark figures standing at the edge of my bed, their faces hidden, their whispers growing louder until I woke up, drenched in sweat. By the 3rd night, I was terrified. I knew there was something in room 7, something dangerous. I had to follow every rule exactly. I closed the bathroom door, kept the window shut, and made sure to listen carefully before answering any knocks. But there was one rule I had forgotten: the cup of water on the nightstand. It was past midnight when I remembered. My heart started to pound as I rushed to fill a cup of water from the bathroom sink and set it on the nightstand. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, trying to calm myself. The room felt different, like the walls were pressing in on me, the shadows growing darker and more defined. I could feel the weight of something unseen watching me. When I finally fell asleep, my dreams were dark and unsettling. I was back in the motel room, but everything felt wrong. The walls seemed to move, expanding and contracting like they were breathing, and shadows gathered in the corners, whispering. Figures stood at the edge of the bed, hidden by darkness. I tried to move, but I felt like something was holding me down, a heavy pressure on my chest that made it hard to breathe. I woke up suddenly, my heart racing. The room was completely dark, and as my eyes adjusted, I saw something that made my blood run cold: long, slender handprints on the outside of the window. A chill went through me, and then I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The room was empty, but I felt like I was being washed. I looked at the cup of water on the nightstand. It was empty. My stomach sank. I must have drunk it in my sleep, breaking another rule. The growl returned, deep and echoing around the room. The shadows gathered again, twisting and shifting into shapes that almost looked like people. My breath caught in my throat, and I shut my eyes, trying to make it all go away. I couldn't help but think, this can't be real. Please, let it stop. I can't take this anymore. The fear was overwhelming, and I felt a desperation I had never known before. The growling got louder, coming from everywhere at once, a horrible guttural sound that seemed to seep into my very bones. When I opened my eyes, the figures were there, surrounding the bed, their faces hidden, their dark hands reaching towards me. They were closer now, and I could see the outlines of their forms, the way their fingers seemed to stretch and curl unnaturally. The figures paused, their hands hovering over me. The shadows seemed to ripple, as if they were deciding what to do. Then, slowly, they began to fade away, dissolving into the darkness. The growling got quieter until the room was silent again. The air was still and cold, and I lay there, shaking, tears in my eyes. I knew I couldn't stay another night. If I did, I was certain that whatever lurked in the shadows would consume me entirely. But when I reached the exit, the door wouldn't budge. I twisted the handle again and again, my panic growing with each failed attempt. It was locked, as if it hadn't been used in years. The windows were boarded up, and the dim light filtering through made everything look even more hopeless. I pounded on the door, my breath coming in short gasps. Panic surged through me, and I turned to see the old man standing behind the front desk, watching me with those tired, emotionless eyes. "I need to leave," I said, my voice shaky, barely above a whisper. "Let me out, please." The old man shook his head slowly, almost sadly. "You can't leave until you've stayed the full nights you paid for," he said, his voice almost apologetic, but there was something cold in his tone, something that made my stomach twist even more. I felt the walls of the room closing in on me, the heavy silence pressing down, and I wanted to scream. A cold dread settled in my stomach. I realized then that I was trapped. There was no way out until I faced the final night, until I followed every rule perfectly. My eyes darted around the lobby, searching for another exit, a back door, anything that could save me from returning to that cursed room. But there was nothing. The old man didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me with that hollow gaze. I took a step back, my body trembling, and knew I had no choice. My heart sank as I turned and slowly walked back down the hallway. Every step felt heavier, like I was walking toward my doom. The hallway seemed longer than before, stretching endlessly, the dim lights flickering above me. I could feel tears stinging my eyes, but I blinked them away. I had to do this. I had no choice but to return to room 7. On the final night, I knew I had to follow every rule perfectly if I wanted to leave alive. I closed the bathroom door, kept the window shut, put the cup of water on the nightstand, and left a coin on the bedside table. I lay in bed, my eyes wide open, the silence in the room almost unbearable. My body was tense, every muscle tight, as I listened for the first sign of trouble. The air felt thick, as if it was weighing me down, and every sound seemed amplified in the deafening stillness. At midnight, the knocking started again. It was soft at first, then got louder and more demanding. Each knock seemed to resonate deep in my bones, vibrating through the bed frame. The whispers followed, voices outside the window, growing in number until it sounded like a crowd murmuring just beyond the thin glass. Shadows moved beyond the glass, forming shapes that twisted and writhed. I kept my eyes on the coin, focusing on it as my only connection to reality, trying to block out the chaos around me. The room felt like it was getting darker, the pressure in the air building until I thought I would scream. My chest felt tight, and it was hard to breathe, like the very air was being sucked out of the room. I felt the mattress dip slightly, as if something had climbed onto the bed. My heart raced, and I clenched my teeth to keep from crying out. I could feel an unnatural coldness spreading from the foot of the bed, moving closer inch by inch. My entire body was paralyzed with fear, my muscles locked in place as I tried to keep my focus on the coin. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could swear I heard my name being called, mixed in with the voices. Then, slowly, the darkness began to lift. The whispers got quieter, the knocking stopped, and the shadows faded away. The air felt lighter, and the pressure on my chest slowly began to release. A faint light started to filter through the curtains, and I realized that dawn was breaking. The sense of relief was overwhelming. I let out a shaky breath and felt tears welling up in my eyes. I had made it. I had survived the final night. My entire body was trembling, but I managed to get out of bed and gather my things. The rules had been followed, and I could feel that whatever haunted room 7 was letting me go. I made my way to the front desk. The old man was there, watching me as I approached. He looked tired, but there was a hint of relief in his eyes as well. "You followed the rules," he said quietly, nodding as I handed him the key. I nodded back, my voice too shaky to speak. I could barely believe that I was finally leaving. Without another word, I turned and walked out the door, stepping into the early morning light. The fresh air hit my face, and I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't felt in days. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove away from the Silver Rest Inn. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I watched the old motel grow smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared from view. I knew, deep down, that I would never return to that place. Room 7 was still there, waiting for the next person who wouldn't listen to the warnings. I didn't want to be one of those idiots who can't follow rules. I'm a no-sleep addict, especially these days, with nothing else to fill my time. I spend endless hours scouring new, and then the archives, for stories that I haven't yet read. My favorite are rules stories. You probably know the kind. I'm a night shift guard at an abandoned mall, and someone left me a strange list of rules. The OP never takes the rules seriously at first. Inevitably, something creepy happens, and they panic and break one. I always thought that it would be so simple for me to follow the rules. By just keeping a clear head, my chance to prove myself came unexpectedly. "Hey, you still looking for a job?" Tony, my roommate, asked me over dinner one night. "Uncle Mike is looking for an overnight warehouse manager." I hurried to chew and swallow a huge mouthful of spaghetti. "I don't have any management experience," I said. Tony waved his fork dismissively. "The title's just for show. All you be doing is keeping an eye on the warehouse. Make sure no one breaks in and stuff." "What's the pay?" $25 an hour. I choked on a piece of onion. As I took a gulp of water, massaging my throat, it occurred to me that Tony was doing me a favor. We'd gotten close over 2 years of living together, and he knew that I needed money in a bad way. "Where do I sign up?" I joked. The next day, an Uber dropped me off at 9 p.m. sharp at the warehouse address. The warehouse was an ugly concrete building nestled between a junkyard and a shuttered dentist's office. I knew it was a dentist's office because of the rotted wood sign over the door, which read "Happy Teeth," next to a chipped picture of a cartoon emoji grinning widely with a full set of realistic human teeth. I pulled open the warehouse's thick metal door and stepped inside. I found myself in a huge, mostly empty room, illuminated by strips of flickering fluorescent lights. A few wooden crates were stacked haphazardly against the far wall, next to another metal door. To my left was a small closet whose door was slightly ajar. To my right, a wooden desk with a chair behind it. On the desk lay a silvery key and a sheet of printer paper. My heart began to beat faster as I picked up the paper and read the following in large black print. "Rules. Lock the door behind you when you enter the building, and again when you leave. Do not open the door for anyone. If they are meant to be here, they will have a key. Do not go into the back room, especially if you hear voices coming from it. Ignore any unusual smells. Never open the crates. If they leak, there is a mop in the janitor's closet. If you see a man in a blue and white striped suit, be polite to him, but do not look at his face. Do not call the police. They are not on your side. Do not talk to anyone who looks like a police officer. They are not on your side." Was this a prank? I tried to recall if I'd mentioned my obsession with rule stories to Tony before. After a moment, I decided that, prank or not, I'd do what I'd wished so many times the OPs of those stories would do. Keep a clear head. Follow the rules. I took the key and locked the heavy metal door behind me. Then I peeked into the closet, discovering that the cramped space doubled as both a janitor's closet and a restroom, containing a urinal, sink, mop, and bucket. Finally, I sat down at the desk, pulled out my phone, and started scrolling Reddit. I was proud of myself for having avoided the obvious trap. If I had gone to scope out the back room, no doubt something would have enticed me to open the door. No, better to stay right here. Several hours of doom scrolling later, I was sitting in my chair, half dozing, when a rattling sound startled me awake. I checked my phone. 1 a.m. I heard the rattling again, coming from the front door. Someone was trying the door handle. I held my breath, staring at the jiggling handle. It occurred to me that there were no windows in the entire warehouse. No one could see in, and I couldn't see out. After a few seconds, the door handle stilled. Boom! The entire door shook as if someone, or something, had struck it with tremendous force. My heart jackhammering in my throat, I stood up and slowly backed away. Boom! 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 My back hit something cold. I was pressed against the back wall. As if a switch had flipped, everything fell still and quiet again. Under my hand, I felt the rugged metal of the door to the back room. Had the sole purpose of the assault by the entity outside been to drive me toward this room? In the sudden silence, I heard something through the wall. It was faint but high-pitched, nibbling just at the edges of my hearing, swelling in volume before dying away again, over and over in an irregular pattern. It sounded like a crying baby. I fled back to my desk, my mind whirring. Could there really be a child trapped back there? Should I call the cops? At that last thought, I snapped back to my senses. My eyes went to the printout on my desk. Do not call the police. I shook my head, smiling at the implausibility of the scenario. A baby in the back room of an industrial warehouse. I needed to keep my wits about me. Nothing else strange happened for the rest of the night. I used part of my first paycheck to buy a pair of noise-canceling headphones and showed up for my second shift with them already over my ears, the noise cancellation on max. I froze as I stepped through the warehouse door. The air smelled wrong. It was coppery, like an old penny, with an unpleasant undertone that reminded me of a sewer leak, a mix of filth and decay. Coughing, I turned and locked the door. As I turned back around, something caught my eye. The crates at the back of the warehouse were sitting in what looked like a pool of tar. Swallowing down a vague feeling of unease, I went to fetch the mop. The tar-colored substance, when I mopped it up, was gloopy like day-old gravy. The coppery smell floated around me, so strong that it almost felt like a physical thing. A mist that saturated my nostrils, my clothes, my lungs with every shallow breath I drew. Something touched the back of my head, and my headphones slid off. I spun around, sloshing dirty water everywhere. A man stood a few feet away with my headphones in his hand. He wore a gaudy suit with cream white and baby blue stripes. A gold bounty sat crooked against a stiff white collar, and his face. I dropped my gaze to the floor, trying to forget my brief impression of his glittering eyes and pale lips. His voice was soft and thin. "Are you the new overnight manager?" he asked. Yes, sir," I forced out. "No headphones," he said. "Stay alert." I bobbed my head like a fool while staring intently at his shiny brown shoes. "Keep up the good work," he said. The shoes shifted, and his clicking footsteps crossed the room, followed by the sound of the front door unlocking. Once I heard the door lock slide back into place, I dared to look up. The warehouse was empty. I quickly finished mopping up the mess by the crates. My headphones were sitting on my desk. I sank into my chair, staring at the round black pads that soaked up the dim light. Had the man come in from outside? Or had he been in the back room? My imagination, running wild, conjured a vision of him standing unnaturally still in the dark, on the other side of the wall. Why had he been there? How long had he been waiting? What if he wasn't the only one? I couldn't calm down. I played on my phone, paced the floor, tried to nap, but no matter what I did, it felt like 1,000 glittering eyes were boring into my back. I needed to see what was in the back room. I read and reread the rules. Do not go into the back room, especially if you hear voices coming from it. I wouldn't go in, I reasoned. I'd listen for voices, then open the door and take a peek. Just a peek, to make sure I was alone. I apprehensively approached the back door, noting how solid it looked, how thick the hinges were. I pressed my ear to the cool metal and closed my eyes. I was greeted by silence, broken only by my shaky breathing. Before I could lose my nerve, I yanked the door open. On the other side was a completely bare concrete room, lit by a naked light bulb dangling from the ceiling. I stared and stared, embarrassment and relief alternately washing over me in waves. Boom! I whipped around. Boom! The front door shook with the force of an unseen impact. Police! A voice shouted from outside. Boom! My eyes dipped to the sheet of rules. They are not on your side. Police! Open up. Boom! The inked words swam in my vision. Do not talk to anyone who looks like a police officer. They are not on your side. My vision exploded with golden stars. The next thing I remember is waking up in a hospital bed and being informed by a stern-faced policewoman that I was under arrest. I was too out of it at the time to follow much of what she said, but I pieced the facts together over the course of my ensuing trial. I had been unwittingly recruited by a criminal organization. The police had been after the big boss, the man in the blue and white suit, when they blew the door to the warehouse with me inside. One of the jury members threw up at the photos of what was found in those crates. No one believed my protestations of innocence. I couldn't explain why I had ignored the crying, mopped up the blood, why I couldn't describe the appearance of the man in the suit, despite having been close enough to touch him. I got 40 years without parole. My life is over, but let me leave you with this warning, in case I might save yours. If you find a strange set of rules, don't follow them. When I was a kid, we discovered something in the woods behind my house. It's been 20 years since that night. The next few weeks were hell for everyone involved. While nobody ever outright said it, I knew they secretly blamed me for what happened to Anthony. Why wouldn't they? I was the last one to ever see him alive. The story went nationwide. A manhunt was launched, and in the following weeks, I swear every square inch of those woods were searched. Every neighbor on our street was questioned again, and then questioned a third time. Eventually, they ran out of people to question and trees to look at, and the search slowly died down. We just accepted that Anthony was gone. The following school year wasn't any easier. I was already an outcast, but usually Anthony was there to stand up for me. Now, I had nobody. Even Tommy, someone who, besides Anthony, I had considered one of my best friends, would no longer talk to me. It's not like I tried, though. We would pass each other in the halls, but we never looked at each other. If we had the same class, we would sit on opposite sides of the classroom. When it came to group projects, we would discuss the bare minimum. The only time he'd said anything unrelated to an assignment was the day before Christmas break that year. We were sitting across from each other, both of us individually working on the assignment we were supposed to do together, when he spoke. You didn't tell anyone, did you, about the deer? I didn't even respond verbally. I just shook my head. I finished the school year alone. There was a small ceremony, and my parents even attempted to have a party to celebrate, but nobody came. Middle school was worse. Tommy and I ended up going to different schools, but enough kids from my previous school attended my current one for word to get around. Eventually, rumors started to spread. The first one I heard is that I had killed Anthony out of jealousy. What would I have been so jealous of that it drove me to murder my best friend and only sibling? I'm not sure. Nobody ever bothered thinking that far into it. After that spread, they got more and more convoluted. Someone suggested that my family were actually cannibals, that we killed and ate Anthony in a ritualistic sacrifice, and that him going missing was just a cover-up for what really happened. I don't remember all of the rumors, but that was the one that really stuck. Soon, we started getting letters in the mail, threatening us and calling us names. At first, we just ignored them. After all, it was just a bunch of kids, right? Then, the vandalism started. They got my dad's car first, slashing his tires and spray painting "Child Killers" on the side. A few days later, while we were all out of the house, Someone smashed in our living room window. We called the cops, but they said there was nothing they could do since nobody saw who did it. We boarded up the window and kept chugging along. The vandalism didn't stop, and eventually the rumors that were contained in the red brick walls of my middle school made their way out. Kids told their parents, and those parents talked to other parents. Eventually, the family of cannibals living on Cherry Lane was the talk of the town. One morning, we showed up for church and were denied entry. But we didn't do anything wrong. My dad pleaded with Pastor Mark. "I believe you, George, but not everyone does. I'm sorry." And then he closed the door in our faces. Mom cried the whole way home. No longer could we go anywhere without being under the scrutinous eye of the public. The grocery store, the library, the movie theater. Even at my dad's work, he got side eyes constantly from customers. After a while, it became too much to bear. I transferred schools over the summer between my 6th and 7th grade years, but the damage was already done. A kid at the new school introduced me to alcohol. A kid named Colin. I got into the routine of hanging out under a bridge after school with the other delinquents and getting so drunk that I couldn't see straight. I blacked out for the first time when I was 13. It wasn't long before my parents caught on, and my drinking only drove a bigger wedge into our already strained relationship. We would fight constantly about where I was, what I was doing, and especially my drinking. These fights would always result in slammed doors or holes in walls. Once, my father even struck me. It was the first and only time he ever laid hands on any of us. I wish I could say that I hit him back, that I laid my old man out flat, spat on him, and showed him who's boss, but I didn't. Instead, I cried. I sobbed into his chest and apologized for everything. They held me and told me that it was okay. Even at that moment, I knew they were lying. I knew they still blamed me for everything that had happened since that night in July. The fights didn't stop there, neither did the drinking. If anything, it ramped up. I was arrested when I was 15. It wasn't even for anything cool either. I didn't try and hijack a car or fight a cop. I jaywalked thinking that nobody was around. A cop flashed his lights, and I ran. I don't even know why. Had I not taken off, the worst that would have happened was a citation or a stern talking to. That night, after I got back home, my parents and I had the biggest fight ever. The one where they outright accused me of doing something to Anthony, and how everything that has happened since is directly my fault. I yelled, called them names, and told them how much I hated them. And then I left. The worst part is I don't think they cared that I was gone. I walked aimlessly around town for a few hours, and when I realized that my parents weren't out looking for me, I found a park bench and went to bed. When I came home the next day, it was as if I hadn't even left. My parents paid no attention to me, and it remained virtually the same for the rest of my school career. We existed in the same space, but I wasn't their son, and they weren't my parents. One night, my dad was sitting in the kitchen when I came home from school. I was a sophomore at the time. "We're moving," he said. "Your mother and I." I just stared at him blankly. "You can come if you want, or you can stay here. We aren't selling the house, but we can't keep living here." And with that, he got up and walked out of the room. When the end of the week rolled around, my parents were gone, and I lived alone. By then I was up to about a fifth a day. My parents had a big collection of varying alcohols they kept locked up. For whatever reason, they left it behind. They took the key, but they didn't ever think I'd break the lock. I stopped going to school. I would wake up, get drunk, and just sit on the couch all day. A few times I toyed with the idea of walking out the back door into the woods and finding a nice tree to climb up and die in. I usually would pass out before I ever made the trek. I think the farthest that I ever got was the back door. Something about those woods, even all these years later, I couldn't bring myself to even consider stepping foot in them again. One day, Colin came over to check on me. The door must not have been locked, because when I woke up, he was just standing over me. "Dude," he gestured vaguely around him. Sorry. If I knew you were coming over, I would have cleaned up the place. I tried to make it sound like a joke, but I don't think he found any humor in it. We talked for hours. I told him about my drinking, how my parents moved out and left me here. Getting arrested, all of it. In his defense, he had no idea what I was going through. He didn't know I drank outside of the parties we went to on rare occasions. After our talk, he offered for me to come stay with him and his parents. He told me that if I said no, he was going to call CPS. I didn't know if he was bluffing, but there was no way foster care is better than this. So I went with him. His parents, for what it's worth, took me in without a second thought. They had heard all the rumors, seen the graffiti and the sideways glances that people around town always gave us, but they didn't buy into it. They didn't see how a child could have done what I was accused of doing. They also didn't see how my parents could hold it against me like they did. I didn't know either. We had a long talk that night. I filled them in on everything that went down with my parents, my drinking problems, and whatnot. They heard me out and cast no judgment, and for that I will be forever grateful. I promised them I would stop drinking, and just to be safe they set me up with a counselor at their church. I didn't believe in God, but something was better than nothing. My grades improved drastically, and by the time I graduated high school, my grades were decent enough for me to get into the same school as Colin with a partial scholarship. What I couldn't afford, Colin's parents helped pay for on the condition that I pay it back after graduation. I'll stop dragging on, but my college experience was pretty mundane. I lived with Colin the whole time, and it was nice to finally be somewhere where nobody knew me or my story. Every now and then we'd mention to someone where we were from, and they'd respond with something along the lines of, "Oh, isn't that where that little boy went missing a few years ago?" But they didn't know that the little boy was my brother, and I never told them. By the time we graduated, I was second in my class, only shortly behind Colin. The night we graduated, his parents took us out to dinner in the city to celebrate, and it was one of the best nights of my life. The life I had back home and the life I had now were completely separated in my mind, and I hardly ever associated with that time in my life. I never really thought about my parents because I considered Colin's parents as my own. I still thought about Anthony every now and then, but we never talked about him. I had moved on, and things were good now. Almost. While we were out for dinner, my phone started ringing in my pocket, which struck me as odd since the only people who ever called me were Colin or his parents. I slipped outside to take the call, and the number that flashed across the screen was our landline number, my parents' landline. My first thought was that my parents moved back into our old home. Now that I was gone, they probably stopped being harassed. Maybe they heard from someone that I had graduated and wanted to congratulate me. I almost didn't take the call out of spite, but there was still a small part of me that wanted my parents to still care about me, to tell me good job and that they were proud of me. I answered the call, but the line was fuzzy. "Hello." The static grew louder. I almost hung up until someone started to speak on the other end. "It's cold," a voice said. "You know what will warm us up." It was a child's voice. It was Anthony's voice. It was the last thing he ever said to me. I heard my 10-year-old voice shout, "No fair. You got a head start," followed by laughter before the line went dead. I stood there in the freezing night air trying to process the phone call. "Eric," Colin called from behind me. I snapped around. Who was on the phone? It was, nothing. Prank call. I closed my phone and followed him back inside. I never told anyone about that phone call. When evil comes from the bloodline. At 14 years old, I lived in a vast 3-story house with my family. It belonged to my grandmother, whom we affectionately called Tita. The second floor was our home. My mother, my Aunt Carla, and I. On the third floor lived my Uncle Mario, with his wife Renata, his stepson, and the twins Nichols and Sophia. Sophia, my cousin, was 2 years younger than me and had health problems since birth. Renata, insisting on being treated only by her trusted doctor, put the twins at risk. She had waited a long time to give birth. Sophia, born second, suffered prolonged hypoxia, a lack of oxygen in her system, which led to epilepsy. She was on medication, and until then, her life had been relatively calm. One morning, like so many others, I went with my mother to let Nico and Sophia know that the school bus had arrived. On the third floor, Nichols was having breakfast while Renata was showering, and my uncle was in the kitchen. Sophia was still in her room. Suddenly, a crashing sound shattered the air, glass breaking. My mother ran to Sophia's room, thinking she was having a seizure, but before she could enter, my cousin came out running, with a bloody piece of glass in her hand. A red liquid dripped behind her, forming a trail with every step she took. Renata, the mother of the twins, screamed. The adults found her in the bathroom. I didn't see what happened. I only heard the screams and chaos. My mother asked me to take Nicholas to the bus and to leave the scene. I obeyed. At that moment, I was the older or protective figure for Nico. When I returned that afternoon, my Aunt Carla told me the truth. Sophia had broken a mirror and taken a shard to attack her mother. She had taken a piece of glass in her hand and pressed it so tightly that she cut herself. All to attack her mother. I still don't know how the adults, our parents, aunts, and uncles, had the courage to tell us, only the older children, what was happening. How do you explain that to a child? In the following days, Renata began to disappear more often. According to Tita, she was seeking help, convinced that what was happening to Sophia was not just physical or mental. She was blaming something beyond our comprehension. Meanwhile, my mother and I took care of Sophia. We soon noticed that Sophia would lose herself in her gaze, staring at some invisible point. If she managed to go to that place, things would happen. One night, my mother was in Renata's kitchen, making dinner. Since she was busy, she asked me to look after Sophia, to distract her. I don't know if you can grasp what my mother was asking of me. It's true that I'm the oldest, but that doesn't mean what was happening to my cousin didn't freeze my blood. I accepted, after all, I loved Sophia, and my mother couldn't handle everything. I found her in the living room trying to do her homework. While we spoke, her expression changed. She shifted from a happy girl telling me about her day into an absent, neutral figure, like a mannequin. Then, she turned her face to look at the end of the hallway, where only darkness lay, the same place where she ran to attack her mother with a piece of glass the first time. Sophia? I called nervously. She didn't respond. She stood up impulsively and began running toward the hallway. I only managed to shout for my mom to help and ran after her, grabbing her. My mother arrived just as I managed to stop her, holding her with all my strength. But Sophia, small and thin, had superhuman strength. I managed to hold her until my mother helped calm her down and took her to bed. From then on, the episodes became more violent. Sophia frequently attacked Renata. One afternoon, my mother ended up with a twisted finger trying to restrain her. It was unthinkable that an 11 or 12-year-old girl could exert such force and injure an adult woman. In our house, the tension was unbearable. Nichols slept with fear or simply didn't sleep at all, saying that Sophia watched him at night. They shared a room, and apparently, at some point, Sophia would sit up abruptly and stare at her brother. At first, he thought it was a joke. Come on, sister, stop it, sleep. But nothing worked. He even tried throwing pillows at a distance to get Sophia to stop staring at him. In the end, he could only wait, nervously hoping the moment would pass quickly, covering his entire body and praying for the night to end. Sophia didn't remember anything that happened the next day. She believed Nico was just trying to prank her. Renata told him not to tell his sister about her condition to avoid worsening her state. The situation reached a climax one night. I heard a noise near the entrance to our floor. Remember, I lived on the second floor with my Tita, my mother, and my Aunt Carla, while Renata and her family lived on the third floor. My room was closest to the entrance, so I must have been the one to notice the noise. Lala, can you open the door? It was Sophia. I recognized her voice, but something stopped me. In any other situation, I would have opened the door, but now, I felt I shouldn't. Sophie, what are you doing there? I asked. She didn't respond. She only repeated, Lala, can you open the door? Sophie, go to sleep. We have to go to school tomorrow. Lala, can you open the door? She said again, this time with a more monotonous, emotionless tone. I thought something was wrong with Sophia, so I decided to go get my mom. When I came back, my mother opened the door with me behind her, looking over her shoulder. I was terrified. More than scared, it was distrust. There was no one there. The hallway connecting our entrance door to the stairs to the third floor was dark, but something was visible. My mother didn't notice. She told me to go to sleep and left. At that moment, I thought maybe I was imagining things, but there was something in the darkness. I could see something at the end of the hallway, right next to the stairs. I squinted my eyes and moved closer to the thing. Suddenly, Sophia stood up and ran toward me. I reacted immediately, spinning on my feet, entering and slamming the door shut. It was a large metallic door, so the sound of the slam woke up my family. But it wasn't just the door's sound. It was mixed with the noise of something banging against it. Sophia. My mother ran in, asking what happened. As best I could, I told her I saw it. My mother asked my Aunt Carla to call Renata or Mario to inform them about what happened with Sophia. My mother wanted to open the door, but I was too scared. I didn't want her to open it. It wasn't good. I clung to my mother with fear while she approached the door. When she opened it, there was nothing. How was that possible? With that slam, I expected Sophia to be lying on the floor, unconscious. Then, Aunt Carla arrived. Renata and Uncle Mario had spoken with her. Sophia was asleep in her bed. According to them, she hadn't left her room since she had gone to sleep. My aunt looked at me with disapproval, but my mother knew. She knew I wasn't lying. Maybe she was a little confused, but I wasn't lying. Something was happening. The next day, while my mother was telling Renata about what had happened, Renata confessed something that had been happening to her even before Sophie's first incident. Renata would wake up with bruises and scratches she couldn't explain. Along with the violent attacks from Sophie, this led her to decide to go to the neighborhood church. That was the place she had been going to every day, almost every afternoon until late at night. At that moment, I thought it couldn't be true. If it were, Sophie should already be fine, right? I don't know what made me follow Renata one of those afternoons. My mother had sent me to buy some things for dinner, and I took a little detour. We arrived at the church. I was clearly keeping a safe distance, but I managed to see how Renata was greeted by the priest. They exchanged greetings, and she handed him something wrapped in cloth. I remember Renata pulling it out of her purse. She removed a kind of red cord, like red threads that were tied and holding whatever the cloth was covering. It was the priest who moved one side of the cloth. I was a bit far from them, hidden behind one of the wooden chairs in the temple. However, I managed to see something that looked like a lock of hair right in the center of the cloth. I looked around. There was no one else in the church besides Renata, the priest, and me, hidden away. When I looked back, I saw the priest leading Renata toward the interior of something. There was a door where church supplies were supposedly kept, and I assumed they were going into that place. I decided to wait a bit, but they didn't come out in the next 10 minutes, and I had to return home with the groceries for dinner. I didn't tell my mother about what I saw. I didn't think it was appropriate. What if she scolded me for spying on the priest? I suppose that among all the adults in the family, they decided to bring the priest home. They gathered around him and told him about what had been happening in our family. Meanwhile, I had to keep an eye on all my little cousins. Some were playing, and Alex was talking to Sophie about something. My mind was split between my duties and my curiosity about the conversation the adults were having with the priest in the living room on our floor, the second floor. I don't know when Sophie walked up beside me and headed for the room where the meeting was taking place. All I know is that when I looked back at where Alex and Sophie were, she was gone. Alex just pointed to the door she had exited, and I ran after her. Sophie appeared in the room while the priest was performing a blessing. I only saw the expression of terror and surprise on the faces of most adults when they saw Sophie's face. I was behind her, so I wasn't a direct witness, but apparently her eyes were white, as if her irises were turned inward. Then she fell to the floor, convulsing like never before. What came out of her mouth wasn't her voice, but something guttural and inhuman. My mother and Renata tried to contain Sophie's convulsions. My Aunt Carla had the phone in hand, calling for emergency services. My Uncle Mario, Sophie's father, just stood there like a stone statue, watching the chaos unfold. I ran to my Tita to help her return to her room, and from there, I went to calm down my little cousins. I didn't know what the hell was happening. The priest continued praying, as if that would help. I thought, worried and angry at the priest's behavior. Exhausted, the priest, the same one who had received the lock of hair, declared that the evil tormenting Sophie had a blood origin, and then looked at Renata. She only managed to lower her gaze and burst into tears. I don't know if everyone understood what I did, but for me, Renata had done something. Something involving Sophie, something connected to what I had witnessed that afternoon in the church. But I didn't say anything. Since that day, everything changed in our family. Sophie was taken to specialists and continued with spiritual visits, but never returned to being the same. Although she no longer suffered violent attacks, something in her had been extinguished, lost. They decided to move into an apartment far from the family home. And over time, we all eventually moved away. Over the years, the memory of those episodes remained buried, but never completely disappeared. Recently, while speaking with my mother and my Aunt Carla, I decided to bring the topic back up. Something inside me told me that I didn't know the full truth. They exchanged a nervous glance before nodding, as if they had been expecting this moment for a long time. "It's time for you to know," said my mother in a solemn tone. What followed left me breathless. Renata had not always been my Uncle Mario's wife. Before him, she was married to a policeman named George, with whom she had a son, William. According to my mother, George was a violent man who controlled every aspect of Renata's life. It was during those years that Renata began doing things that no one in the family fully understood. One day, Renata told them she had attended a fire ritual. The ceremony involved a circle of flames being drawn around her, while a healer murmured words in an unknown language. Although she never explained the purpose, she hinted that it was to protect herself. My mother and my aunt speculated that it was something related to her ex-husband, and that she had resorted to such extremes during her marriage with George. Renata's behavior became even stranger after the death of her father. During the funeral, she and her sister walked 3 times over their father's grave. Exactly 3 times, an act she never explained, but that left everyone uneasy. Then came the advice she gave to a family acquaintance whose son was addicted to drugs. Renata suggested something disturbing: preparing a meal with sewer rat babies, assuring him that the dirtier they were, the better. According to the acquaintance, the ritual was to appease the rebellious spirit of the young man. The acquaintance later told this to my aunt with a worried tone, saying that the woman did very strange things, and it was better not to get involved with her. By then, my Uncle Mario had already married Renata civilly, and my aunt couldn't intervene in her son's life, even though she tried to warn others. My mother and aunt also spoke about William, Renata's eldest son, who displayed troubling behaviors. From a young age, he showed a tendency toward violence, especially against defenseless animals. The family discovered, on multiple occasions, skins of rabbits, cats, and dogs stretched out and drying in the sun. William's doing. The horror reached a climax when Sophia was 8 years old. Katie, Sophia's pet, had a litter of puppies. But one morning, all the puppies were found dead. My aunt said that William had killed them, seemingly pushing the tank into a wall instead of helping them when some got trapped behind it. The most terrifying incident involved a kitten William had. The kitten became pregnant and gave birth to 4 babies. A few days later, they found it covered in blood, with traces in its mouth and paws. Apparently, it had devoured its own kittens. My Aunt Carla ended with a warning. The animals behaved strangely around William, and years later, around Sophia too. Hearing all of this, I realized that what I experienced with Sophia wasn't an isolated case, but part of something deeper, darker, and more twisted that had been brewing over the years. Then I remembered what the priest had said. The evil tormenting Sophie had a blood origin. Even today, I still wonder if everything I lived through was real, if Sophia's experiences were a result of an illness or something else. And until now, I had remained silent about what I saw, about what Renata had done to Sophie, hiding as an observer. But I truly always felt guilty, an accomplice. Maybe if I had spoken up, if Sophie would still be with us. I thought she died, but she has a YouTube channel. I've always believed we needed to let go of the ones we've lost, no matter how much it hurts. But no one warned me what to do if they came back. How grief, pain, and sorrow, things I was so sure were real, could suddenly feel like lies. I was 7 when he died. Back then, I never truly understood how much his presence meant to me. The memory of his last days still haunts me. The antiseptic hospital smell, the hushed murmurs of passing nurses, and his last words, perfectly clear despite his weakness. "Take care of your mother for me, buddy." After they took him away, I found Mom on her knees in the hallway after the doctor spoke to her. I remember thinking how strange it was to see an adult break that way. Life blurred after his death. Mom crumbled, and I learned to raise myself. Cooking, homework, childhood crisis. Some nights, I'd find her in Dad's armchair, still in work clothes, staring at his photo. She'd kiss me back to bed, her tears marking my forehead, despite her mumbled excuses about dust. Growing up without him was difficult, but we managed. The years passed, and we settled into our routine. I kept his memory alive in small ways, wearing his broken watch, using his old things. Mom said grief does that, though she never explained why. Maybe we're both still figuring it out. As I got older, the memories of him began to fade. His eyes. I couldn't remember if they were brown or hazel. Mom kept his photos, but somehow, they never seemed to capture him in the right light. I held on to them as a reminder. Then came that day in my sophomore year when everything changed. Walking home that crisp autumn day, a familiar scent stopped me. Applewood smoke, though no one on our street had a working fireplace anymore. At the corner, our house looked wrong. Time seemed to have reversed itself. Dad's bluebells swayed in the dead garden, spring flowers in autumn, and his wind chimes sang without wind. The scent hit me as I opened the front door. Fresh coffee and pancakes. We hadn't had coffee made here in years. From the living room came a sound I'd almost forgotten. Mom's genuine laughter, accompanied by a deeper voice that made my heart stutter. The hallway stretched endlessly. Dad's cardigan hung on the banister, warm to touch. His crossword puzzle lay unfinished, the pen still warm, his shoes exactly where he always left them. Each detail clicked into place with terrifying precision. In the living room, Mom curled against him on the couch. There sat my father, impossibly real. Reading glasses perched on his nose, that untamable eyebrow, even the coffee stain Mom always scolded him about. "Welcome home, buddy," he said. Mom beamed beside him, her hand in his, looking younger than she had in years. The weight of grief seemed to have melted away. She looked at him the way she used to, the way I'd almost forgotten, like he was her entire world. "Dad," I whispered, my voice shaking not from terror, but from the weight of what I was seeing. He smiled at me with that slightly crooked incisor He chipped playing baseball when he was 12. I missed you so much, he said, his voice catching slightly, exactly the way it used to when he was trying not to cry. Mom announced dinner was ready, casual as anything. The smell of his favorite meatloaf drifted from the kitchen, the recipe his mother had passed down, the one Mom had never quite mastered in all the years since. But now it smelled perfect. I couldn't move, because I remembered holding my father's cold hand at the funeral. I remembered watching them lower his casket into the ground. I remembered 9 years of grieving, of missing him, of learning to live without him. And here he was, impossible but real. I backed into the door. "How are you here?" My voice cracked. Dad's face shifted to that familiar concerned expression as he stepped forward, hands open, exactly how he'd approach my childhood tantrums. "What's wrong, buddy?" His voice held that perfect mix of worry and love I'd fought to remember. Mom appeared, wiping her hands on her anniversary apron, the one that should have been yellowed with age, but looked brand new. I kept my distance, the door my anchor to reality. Everything felt real. That was the problem. I looked at my mother, really looked at her. She looked happy, genuinely, completely happy, in a way I hadn't seen since before the hospital. I wanted to run, to escape, yet I couldn't leave her here with whatever this was, even if it felt like Dad, even if it smiled like him and moved like him and remembered everything exactly right. I lunged forward and grabbed her hand. "Mom, we have to go," I said, pulling her toward the door. She resisted, her eyes filling with tears. "Honey, what's gotten into you?" Her voice broke just like it used to when I disappointed her. "Why are you trying to ruin this? We're finally whole again." I dragged her outside, past the garden where those impossible bluebells bloomed. The street was empty except for the glow from neighbors' windows. Mom fought against me, repeating, "It's okay," over and over. When I looked back, my father, or whatever wore his face, stood in our doorway, watching us with that familiar hurt expression. "Mom, please," I begged. "He died. You remember the funeral. You remember everything after." But my words faltered as she looked at me with genuine confusion. "What are you talking about? Your father's right there. He's always been here." She touched my forehead like checking for a fever. "Are you feeling okay? You've been working so hard at school lately." "No, he's dead. Mom, he's dead." The words felt less certain now, seeing him there in the doorway, looking exactly as a father should when worried about his child. Everything I remembered about the funeral seemed to blur, like a dream fading in the morning light. His footsteps on the path carried that familiar unevenness from his old injury. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home. Whatever's bothering you, we can figure it out together. We always do." I felt something in my mind shift as his footsteps drew closer. Slowly, each memory of my father began adjusting to accept this new reality. "Son," he said, and his voice carried all the warmth I'd been missing for 9 years. "He's dead," I whispered, but even as I said it, I noticed Mom's expression, patient, waiting, like she knew exactly what I was going through, like she'd made this choice before, but I couldn't accept this. I wouldn't disrespect my father's memory, the hardship we'd faced, the pain we'd endured. "Please, Mom, wake up. This isn't real," I said as I tried to pull her, but this time I couldn't move. No, the truth was I wouldn't move, my body betraying me. "Your father's been worried about you," she said softly. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw everything there. Understanding, grief, choice. Sometimes, she added carefully, happiness is right in front of us, if we just let it be. He was closer now, and I could smell his aftershave, the same brand I'd kept unopened in my drawer for years. Yet the memory felt uncertain now, like trying to hold on to water. I tried to remember the funeral, but the images kept shifting, then fading. "Do you remember how he used to push you on the swings?" Mom asked, her voice gentle. "How he never pushed too high because you were scared of heights. Every Sunday, Dad added, and suddenly I could see it clearly, the creak of the swing set, his hand steady on my back, my laughter carrying across the yard. Had that happened before or after? Did it matter anymore? I looked at him, really looked. He wasn't perfect. There were new wrinkles around his eyes that my memories hadn't included. His hair was slightly grayer than in the photos. He looked lived in, real, like he'd been aging alongside us all this time. Dad? I said again, but this time it wasn't a question born of fear. Something in my mind whispered that this was wrong, that there was another set of memories trying to claim space. Cold hands, a casket, years of absence. But those memories felt distant now, like a dream I'd once had. This felt real. His smile, Mom's hand in mine, the smell of dinner waiting at home. "Come on, buddy," he said, holding out his hand. "Your mom's lasagna is getting cold." I looked at Mom one last time. There was something in her eyes. Knowledge, maybe, or understanding. A tiny nod, so slight I might have imagined it. A choice being offered. I took his hand. It was warm. That night, my reflection caught my eye. Something questioning in my gaze. Then Dad called about tomorrow's fishing trip. The one we'd planned for weeks. The one we'd always done. Every year. Forever. And I let the doubt slip away. After all, why question happiness? Dad's home. He's always been home. And if sometimes, late at night, I remember another life, well, that's just a bad dream. Mom says they fade. Don't they? I was scrolling through the YouTube watching random videos. It happened on last Friday. It was around 11 in the night. I was chilling as it was a weekend. I live in an apartment. I earn a decent money. 9-to-5 job. Single. Life was pretty good. I never really, in my wildest dreams, thought that a YouTube video would cause a chaos in my peaceful life. Before that, I need you to get to know about Jocelyn. She's dead, or that's what we were thinking till now. She was a high school friend of mine. You could see that she was always depressed, or her face naturally became like that due to family situation she was enduring with. She was a poor kid. Her father was a heroin addict. Her mother tried her best to give at least an average life to her daughter, which she never had. But Jocelyn never smiled. She was the target of many bullies. She was also sexually assaulted by few shitheads. But she never complained. No one treated her as a friend. Everyone saw her like someone they must show pity. But I and Jocelyn were somewhat close. I felt strangely comfortable with her. Many of my friends would mock me for speaking with her, but I never cared. She was suicidal during her last days in the school. During a month before the finals, the sexual assaults got too much for her and pushed her off the edge. One day, she stormed out of the classroom fighting to hold her tears back, everyone laughing at her back. The teacher didn't stop her. She went to the nurse's room, got a blade and tried to end her life. I was in another class when this all happened. But at the last moment I got hold of her. If I were a minute late, she would have ended her life. But I don't exactly remember how I went to her at the right moment. All I remember is she got a scar on the right index and middle finger for life. This is not the worst. A week after finals, she disappeared. That's it. No one ever saw her again. It was like she just vanished into the thin air. The whole police team with hundreds of volunteers searched every place possible. But she never was found. People decided that she ran on her own while leaving her mother alone to survive. They thought she was fed up with her family. Some other, including her mother and me, believed that she's dead. I believe that she was dead because I know Jocelyn better than anyone. She will not just run leaving behind everything. Of course, she was suicidal. But it was in the past, and that was too because of the sexual abuse, not because of her family situation. And the therapy sessions changed her a lot. She will not run. If you can't believe me, then at least you must believe that no one is stupid enough to leave everything behind before running. She didn't even take money, nor any change of dress. Everything was untouched in her home as it was left. The police investigated on all possible ways, but in vain. It all happened a decade ago. Jocelyn became a distant memory and a dead person standing along with me in some school photos. That's it. I would miss her during those moments when your mind will bring back some memories like a thunder crashing on the earth, which would have been unrelated to the situation at that time. I saw Jocelyn as malnourished grown woman in a YouTube channel at that time. The revelation was made by my mind in a split second, pushing me into a deep shock. My jaw dropped in a very cartoonish way. I was just sitting there without moving for a whole damn minute, watching the thumbnail. The video was about how to make a homemade slime borax. It was a 31 minutes long video. Every YouTube user would have crossed videos like this. I clicked on it. The channel name is A9842M. It has some 3 videos with almost no subscribers. The total view count of the channel would have been 20 to 30. Jocelyn started explaining the procedure to make a slime with an artificial smile in her face. The method, she said, was almost a known method to everyone. But what mattered most is the way she expressed it. It was full of artificial mannerism. It was like someone forced her to do that. By slowing the video, I was becoming more convinced that she is Jocelyn. At one point, the camera focused on her right hand. At that moment, I noticed the scar. It was almost very light, but was noticeable. It was exactly the same. No one would get an exact photocopy of a scar. I am damn sure. I will swear to God that she is Jocelyn. The same Jocelyn who the world thought was long dead. I was not able to believe. I went to the other 2 videos. The another video was how to make a homemade glue. It was some 7 minutes long. The most disturbing thing in that video was Jocelyn's eyes were bloodshot, like she was drugged. And at some point I could hear some muffled screaming sound at the background. The most recent video was a girl's hand near some meat, probably beef. It was not Jocelyn's hand. I compared with the previous video. I was sleepless the whole night. I was not sure what to do. I am not sure whether should I call the police or not. I subscribed to that channel and opened YouTube for every 40 minutes like a madman the next day. The most disturbing thing happened on the Sunday. It gave chills down my spine. I was again rewatching the 3 videos when the channel went live. I joined immediately. To my horror, my apartment was being recorded. It zoomed a particular window. It was my *king bedroom's window, which was covered by a plain green lantern. That's all. The screen went black. The live ended. I was scared as *. I was too scared to get out of own house. I locked every doors, windows, and got back to my bedroom with my laptop. To my horror, every videos on the peculiar channel has been deleted, but I have recorded the videos of Jocelyn. It's in my phone's gallery. I'm very scared to make a move. Whatever or whoever Jocelyn is stuck with is very bad. They have some power, maybe supernatural. I just can't get normal. No way they recorded my apartment as a coincidence. It is like a warning not to mess with them anymore, though I did nothing than watching the videos in loop. It's always like someone is watching me. Should I go to the police? The story of how I came back from the dead to join the living. I was 8 when I became a ghost, rising from the shallow grave where my stepfather had buried me in the woods behind our house. I still remember the moment of my murder. I knew it was coming. You can sense when you are the object of hate, right? Like a big black hot ball of energy coming at you, ready to crush you. I knew he was going to hurt me. The way he looked at me. The way he never said my name. The way he seemed to bump up against me. He had made me fall a few times, once down the stairs, but I had not been seriously hurt. Just bruises. And then one day, my mother was out. I had tried not to be alone with him, but he cornered me in the kitchen. I was at the fridge, scrounging around for something to eat. The last thing I remembered was his eyes as he lunged in for the attack. There was a flash of horrible pain, and I heard myself scream. I tasted blood. Then everything went dark. The last thought I had was, well, now I'm dead. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. And when I opened my eyes, I knew I had become a ghost. And my first thought was, now he can't hurt me anymore. I knew humans couldn't touch ghosts, so I was happy to be one. I stood over the grave he had dug for me and thought about what to do. Ghosts go back to the places they live. And so I went back to the house. There was nowhere else for me to be. I didn't go in. Even though I knew as a ghost he couldn't hurt me, I didn't want to be seen. I went straight into the basement. That seemed like a good place for a ghost. I made myself a sort of hidey place in the back and stayed there. Time passed. Sometimes I would go up in the dead of night, poking around in the kitchen. Then one night I crept up to their bedroom and stood at the foot of their bed. My mother jerked out of sleep, sat up, stared at me, and then screamed and screamed. I fled back to my hidey hole in the basement. I never tried going up again. They left that house soon after, and others came. But they didn't stay long either. As much fun as it is to imagine haunted houses, it actually isn't fun to live in one. And so families came and went, and I grew more forgetful about how living humans do things. I look back to those years as if in a dream now, my ghostly existence flitting through the house, the basement, and the woods. Time lost its meaning for me. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Until Lily and her family came. Lily was often ill and couldn't get out and run around like others. I heard it whispered through the walls that she may not live much longer. I wondered if she would become a ghost like me, perhaps joining me in my basement home, creeping up to the kitchen and out into the woods every now and then. It wouldn't be terrible to have a companion in the dark and dreary basement. So, despite what had happened those years ago, when my mother sat up in bed screaming and screaming, her mouth an open black hole of suffering and misery, I decided to visit Lily in the bedroom where she lay in bed. Late one night, I crept up to her room and quietly laid my hand on the doorknob and swung it open. I heard Lily restlessly move and then sit up. She stared at me in the dim night glow. I waited for her to scream, but she didn't. Instead, she said quite clearly, I heard it was a little boy who haunted this house. But you are a young man. Nobody had spoken to me for so long. I frowned, trying to understand her words. She spoke again. Who are you? She asked. I understood that one. I am Daniel, a ghost. It had been years since I had spoken, but the words were coming to me. I remembered becoming a ghost. Lily got out of bed and walked towards me. Daniel. She reached out, took my wrist, and holding it tight, turned me to a large shimmering mirror against the wall. I saw myself, a lanky, pale young man looking back at me. I was so confused. I turned back to Lily. Memories and futures started running through my mind. Lily said quietly, "You're not a ghost, Daniel." I can still remember the warmth of my tears on my cheeks as they squeezed out of my eyes. I closed my eyes briefly, remembering the time I thought I became a ghost, opening my eyes, seeing the flecks of blue-black night sky and stars through the loose earth over me, my hands scrabbling through and pulling me out. I remembered the cool air on my face as I crawled out of my grave and started walking home, covered with dried blood. "You're alive," said Lily, and I was there in her room, looking into a mirror at myself, a young man. A car drove by outside, its bright lights shining into the room and lighting up my face. Lily sat me down next to her, on the edge of the bed. We began talking. And I never lived as a ghost again. I loved my father, but he came back. I always believed we needed to let go of the ones we've lost, no matter how much it hurts. But no one warned me what to do if they came back. How grief, pain, and sorrow, things I was so sure were real, could suddenly feel like lies. I was 7 when he died. Back then, I never truly understood how much his presence meant to me. The memory of his last days still haunts me. The antiseptic hospital smell, the hushed murmurs of passing nurses, and his last words, perfectly clear despite his weakness. "Take care of your mother for me, buddy." After they took him away, I found Mom on her knees in the hallway after the doctor spoke to her. I remember thinking how strange it was to see an adult break that way. Life blurred after his death. Mom crumbled, and I learned to raise myself. Cooking, homework, childhood crisis. Some nights, I'd find her in Dad's armchair, still in work clothes, staring at his photo. She'd kiss me back to bed, her tears marking my forehead, despite her mumbled excuses about dust. Growing up without him was difficult, but we managed. The years passed, and we settled into our routine. I kept his memory alive in small ways, wearing his broken watch, using his old things. Mom said grief does that, though she never explained why. Maybe we're both still figuring it out. As I got older, the memories of him began to fade. His eyes, I couldn't remember if they were brown or hazel. Mom kept his photos, but somehow they never seemed to capture him in the right light. I held on to them as a reminder. Then came that day in my sophomore year when everything changed. Walking home that crisp autumn day, a familiar scent stopped me. Applewood smoke, though none on our street had a working fireplace anymore. At the corner, our house looked wrong. Time seemed to have reversed itself. Dad's bluebells swayed in the dead garden, spring flowers in autumn, and his wind chimes sang without wind. The scent hit me as I opened the front door. Fresh coffee and pancakes. We hadn't had coffee made here in years. From the living room came a sound I'd almost forgotten. Mom's genuine laughter, accompanied by a deeper voice that made my heart stutter. The hallway stretched endlessly. Dad's cardigan hung on the banister, warm to touch. His crossword puzzle lay unfinished, the pen still warm, his shoes exactly where he always left them. Each detail clicked into place with terrifying precision. In the living room, Mom curled against him on the couch. There sat my father, impossibly real, reading glasses perched on his nose, that untomable eyebrow, even the coffee stain Mom always scolded him about. "Welcome home, buddy," he said. Mom beamed beside him, her hand in his, looking younger than she had in years. The weight of grief seemed to have melted away. She looked at him the way she used to, the way I'd almost forgotten, like he was her entire world. "Dad?" I whispered, my voice shaking not from terror, but from the weight of what I was seeing. He smiled at me with that slightly crooked incisor he'd chipped playing baseball when he was 12. "I missed you so much," he said, his voice catching slightly, exactly the way it used to when he was trying not to cry. Mom announced dinner was ready, casual as anything. The smell of his favorite meatloaf drifted from the kitchen, the recipe his mother had passed down, the one Mom had never quite mastered in all the years since. But now it smelled perfect. I couldn't move, because I remembered holding my father's cold hand at the funeral. I remembered watching them lower his casket into the ground. I remembered 9 years of grieving, of missing him, of learning to live without him. And here he was, impossible but real. I backed into the door. "How are you here?" My voice cracked. Dad's face shifted to that familiar concerned expression as he stepped forward, hands open. Exactly how he'd approach my childhood tantrums. "What's wrong, buddy?" His voice held that perfect mix of worry and love I'd fought to remember. Mom appeared, wiping her hands on her anniversary apron, the one that should have been yellowed with age, but looked brand new. I kept my distance, the door my anchor to reality. Everything felt real. That was the problem. I looked at my mother, really looked at her. She looked happy, genuinely, completely happy, in a way I hadn't seen since before the hospital. I wanted to run, to escape, yet I couldn't leave her here with whatever this was, even if it felt like Dad, even if it smiled like him and moved like him and remembered everything exactly right. I lunged forward and grabbed her hand. "Mom, we have to go," I said, pulling her toward the door. She resisted, her eyes filling with tears. "Honey, what's gotten into you?" Her voice broke just like it used to when I disappointed her. "Why are you trying to ruin this? We're finally whole again." I dragged her outside, past the garden where those impossible bluebells bloomed. The street was empty except for the glow from neighbors' windows. Mom fought against me, repeating "it's okay" over and over. When I looked back, my father, or whatever wore his face, stood in our doorway, watching us with that familiar hurt expression. "Mom, please," I begged. "He died. You remember the funeral. You remember everything after." But my words faltered as she looked at me with genuine confusion. "What are you talking about? Your father's right there. He's always been here." She touched my forehead like checking for a fever. "Are you feeling okay? You've been working so hard at school lately." "No, he's dead. Mom, he's dead." The words felt less certain now, seeing him there in the doorway, looking exactly as a father should when worried about his child. Everything I remembered about the funeral seemed to blur, like a dream fading in the morning light. His footsteps on the path carried that familiar unevenness from his old injury. "Come on, buddy. Let's go home. Whatever's bothering you, we can figure it out together. We always do." I felt something in my mind shift as his footsteps drew closer. Slowly, each memory of my father began adjusting to accept this new reality. "Son," he said, and his voice carried all the warmth I'd been missing for 9 years. "He's dead," I whispered, but even as I said it, I noticed Mom's expression. Patient, waiting, like she knew exactly what I was going through, like she'd made this choice before. But I couldn't accept this. I wouldn't disrespect my father's memory, the hardship we'd faced, the pain we'd endured. "Please, Mom, wake up. This isn't real," I said as I tried to pull her, but this time I couldn't move. No, the truth was I wouldn't move, my body betraying me. "Your father's been worried about you," she said softly. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, just a moment, I saw everything there. Understanding, grief, choice. Sometimes, she added carefully, happiness is right in front of us, if we just let it be. He was closer now, and I could smell his aftershave. The same brand I'd kept unopened in my drawer for years. Yet the memory felt uncertain now, like trying to hold on to water. I tried to remember the funeral, but the images kept shifting, then fading. "Do you remember how he used to push you on the swings?" Mom asked, her voice gentle. "How he never pushed too high because you were scared of heights." "Every Sunday," Dad added, and suddenly I could see it clearly. The creak of the swing set, his hand steady on my back, my laughter carrying across the yard. Had that happened before or after? Did it matter anymore? I looked at him, really looked. He wasn't perfect. There were new wrinkles around his eyes that my memories hadn't included. His hair was slightly grayer than in the photos. He looked lived in, real, like he'd been aging alongside us all this time. "Dad?" I said again, but this time it wasn't a question born of fear. Something in my mind whispered that this was wrong, that there was another set of memories trying to claim space. Cold hands, a casket, years of absence. But those memories felt distant now, like a dream I'd once had. This felt real. His smile, Mom's hand in mine, the smell of dinner waiting at home. "Come on, buddy," he said, holding out his hand. "Your mom's lasagna is getting cold." I looked at Mom one last time. There was something in her eyes. Knowledge, maybe, or understanding. A tiny nod, so slight I might have imagined it. A choice being offered. I took his hand. It was warm. That night, my reflection caught my eye. Something questioning in my gaze. Then Dad called about tomorrow's fishing trip. The one we'd planned for weeks. The one we'd always done, every year, forever. And I let the doubt slip away. After all, why question happiness? Dad's home. He's always been home. And if sometimes, late at night, I remember another life, well, that's just a bad dream. Mom says they fade, don't they? I'm so cold. I'm a USSS officer. The following story is transcribed from a notebook I found whilst out on a hike. What you're about to read may cause discomfort. My boss told me to dispose of this note, so we don't have any copycat offenders trying to find what the victim found. So please, don't be dumb. Stay out of the forest if you're not prepared. Mother Nature is a loving mother, but even mothers can't protect their children 100% of the time. If you're reading this, it's found me. My fire is dying, and I'm out of matches. This all started innocently enough. I just wanted to go on a hunting trip in honor of my father. He died when I was a young man. Growing up, he would take me hunting and fishing all the time. In his memory, I decided to go on a hunting/camping trip. Little did I know that I was the one being hunted. 3 weeks ago, my tracking Labrador Nikita and I drove out deep into the woods of Hiawatha National Forest in the Oop. I hadn't been hunting in a while, so I used up all my vacation hours, got some sub-zero camping gear, made sure my muzzleload rifle was clean, and loaded Nikita up into my 2005 Buick Rendezvous. When I got to my campsite, it started to snow. This was in mid-December for the muzzleloader season. The campsite was pretty remote. It was a 45-ish minute drive off the main road. I let Kita out to explore her surroundings, and the second she put her nose to the ground to sniff, all the fur from the tip of her nose to the end of her tail stood on end. She froze in place. She started to growl as she stiff-legged it back to the car. She jumped in and began to whine. I assumed that she just caught a whiff of a bear or a coyote. She'd never been this deep into any woods before. I thought she just needed to get used to the new smells. The first couple weeks was fine. Kita and I mostly just putzed around the forest enjoying nature. I saw a cute raccoon in a tree, but it didn't want anything to do with us. The weirdness started when the sun began its descent into the night sky. While I was out gathering firewood one evening around dusk, I heard the first whistle. I had no idea what it was, but I didn't like it. Kita really didn't like it, so we started back to the campsite. While walking back, there was another whistle, a little closer this time. I began to jog. Kita was just stiff as a board trotting alongside me. I could just see the campsite now. The last whistle sounded like it was right behind me. I could practically feel the breath on my neck. I'd burst into a full-blown sprint now. Just before I could reach the site, my foot caught on a hidden tree root. An unbelievable pain jolted up my leg. I felt a curare kick in my ankle. I didn't need a medical degree to know that I'd broken something in my ankle or foot. That's when I noticed my car. It looked like a bear had gotten into it. The damage looked really bad in the dark. At least one flat tire and broken windows. I hopped in to see if I could start it up. The engine wouldn't turn over. This damned cold was doing a real number on the electrical system in my car. My ankle was gonna have to wait to see a doctor until the next morning. Hopefully, it'll warm up enough and I can change the tire and get out of here. I managed to get a fire going, and I was cooking up yet another hot dog for me to eat while I was nursing my ankle. The fire was bathing me in its warm glow, and I fashioned a pretty shoddy splint when all of the sudden Kita's nose shot straight up. She was looking just past where the light of the fire illuminated the surrounding area, just past the car. She began to growl deep in her guts. I'd heard her growl before, like when the mailman dropped off packages at our front door. This was different. This was deeply defensive. A gutturally primal growl as if she were channeling the early domesticated wolves. The fire's heat went cold. As I looked around us, with my hand on my pistol I had brought for defense, what little color there was in this winter wasteland was leached out, almost as if it were trying to hide itself. Then I heard it. Another whistle. A 3-part tune that went low-high-low. I pulled out my pistol, stood up, and began hobbling towards the direction of the whistle. I figured it wasn't impossible that someone else had found us. During the summer months, this site was really popular with the backpacking community. The snow was crunching and squeaking beneath my feet. I was unbelievably cold. When I got to the back of my rendezvous, I saw the prints that the whistler left behind. They looked like oversized dog prints, but the toes were too far from the pad. The prints were also webbed. They led off into the woods towards the pond I'd gotten my water to quench the fire from. I looked back, and the fire was dying. Kita was also desperately trying to get into the tent. I'd concluded that it was time to go to bed. I started up the kerosene heater, made sure Kita was covered up, and crawled into my sleeping bag. I kept my pistol always within reach. I popped a couple ibuprofen. The next morning, I was planning on leaving. I'd communed with nature, and nature told me to get out. The Whistler had other plans. I reassessed the damage to my car in the morning in the hope that I could fix it. I needed to get out of here. The damage was far worse than I could see in the dark. Every tire was slashed. Every window was broken. All my seats were torn to ribbons. The wires under the steering column were all torn out. Whatever had approached us last night didn't want me to leave. I think the Whistler came back while I was asleep. There was no way I was walking out of here on this bum ankle. I took inventory of my provisions. I had packed enough food to finish the trip, but the Whistler had taken most of it. All of the extra dry wood I had brought that wasn't in the tent with me was gone. I had maybe enough food and wood for one night. Maybe two if I rationed it well. The nearest town was easily 2 hours by car from my location. I was stranded. It's been 4 days since the first encounter with the Whistler. My ankle has swollen 5 times its usual size. Every night the Whistler torments me. With its constant low, high-low whistles, it thrashes around, breaking branches and throwing them at the tent. It won't come within 20 feet from the tent. I think it doesn't like Kita's smell. I'm running out of kerosene. Kita's breathing has become raspy. Yesterday she came back soaking wet from the direction of the pond. I'm scared she fell through the ice. I shouldn't have let her out of my sight, but she bolted and I couldn't hobble fast enough to catch her. I'm worried she's getting sick. I put one of my hoodies and thermal vests on her. If it weren't for the circumstances, she'd look really cute. Every night the temperature drops. Last night, it hit -7 degrees Fahrenheit. I have maybe 3 cups of kerosene left. It's been 1 week since the Whistler began our torment. Kita's breathing has only gotten worse. She doesn't get up anymore. She can't even go outside to pee. She just lets it loose in the tent. Every time she does, she looks at me with those big sad eyes. She doesn't know any better. I'm not mad at her. I just want her to be comfortable. My cell phone died. Not that it was doing me any good. I don't have any service this deep into the woods. I had a satellite phone, but I don't know where it went. I think the Whistler got to it. It's smart. It purposely isolated me. I've been reinforcing the tent as best I can. I've made a basic frame of sticks and logs around it. I've been packing snow and pine boughs on them to insulate the tent. I think I saw that on Man's Wild one time. I'm not sure. The Whistler's tracks surround my camp, a huge circle now roughly only 15 feet from my tent. I'm out of kerosene now. Kita and I huddle for warmth. Every now and then I strike a match, just to feel some warmth. My toes are completely numb, and my nose is turning purple. It's getting harder and harder to write. My hands are forgetting how to hold a pencil in this cold. My tears have frozen to my cheeks, and my breath has turned my beard into a block of ice. My ankle only feels worse and worse with the cold setting in. I woke up this morning, and Kita was gone. Not gone as in she got out, but rather she died in her sleep last night. Her lungs last night sounded like the crinkling of a paper bag. I'm not proud to say this, but I cut her open to feel some warmth. I plunged my hands into her. Star Wars lied to me. There was no warmth to be found in her, just bloody entrails. I'm sorry, Kita. I'm just so hungry. I inspected my feet today. They've turned purply black. My nose no longer feels the cold. Even with all my clothes on, the piercing glacial temps stab into me like a swarm of bees. The thermometer now reads -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Every electron in my body craves warmth. The Whistler is right outside my tent. Low, high-low whistles bore their way into my ears. I'm gonna try and make the hike tomorrow morning. Screw my ankle. I'm dead either way, right? That was a horrible idea. I got all turned around looking for the road. Every time I'd get going, I discovered I had only made one large circle due to favoring my good ankle. On my last attempt, I found myself on the pond. The ice cracked and gave way beneath my feet, and my whole lower half went into the water. The icy knives of cold and death stabbed into me. I managed to crawl back to my tent. I pulled all of my clothes off and the rest of my clothes outside. I lit them on fire and basked in the warmth. The Whistler is looking at me now. His jaws hang open as the low high-low rings from his gullet. His enormous furry body looks so warm. I crave his embrace. His maw is ready to strike. This is the last entry in my journal. He looks so hungry. I'm so cold. Maybe I shouldn't have posted this. Maybe my boss was right. If you're reading this, I beg you, don't go into the woods in the winter. At least not alone. And whatever you do, stay warm. Cavern under the cabin. The shadow beneath the lake. Deep in the forests of Maine, hidden from the eyes of civilization, lay a lake known only to locals as Blackwater Hollow. The lake was a place of whispered stories and dire warnings, a place where fishermen refused to cast their lines, and where the bravest of children dared not swim. Its surface was black as pitch, even under the summer sun, and no matter how hard the wind blew, it remained still, like a vast mirror reflecting the emptiness of the sky. It was on the edge of this lake that a young woman named Evelyn came to escape the chaos of her life. After the sudden loss of her husband, she sought solace in the isolation of a cabin her grandparents had left her. She arrived late in the autumn, the trees a tangle of bare branches clawing at a leaden sky. The cabin was small, modest, and surrounded by an oppressive quiet that made her footsteps echo louder than they should have. Evelyn was warned by the clerk at the general store to stay away from the lake. "Nothing good comes out of Blackwater Hollow," he muttered, sliding her bag of groceries across the counter. Evelyn smiled politely but didn't respond. She wasn't one to believe in superstitions. Besides, the lake was beautiful in its eerie way, a stark, unbroken void amidst the dense forest. She thought it might help her find the peace she desperately needed. That first night, Evelyn sat by the fireplace, sipping tea and listening to the wind howl through the trees. She had nearly fallen asleep when she heard it, a faint knock at the door. Her heart quickened. She hadn't seen another soul since arriving, and the cabin was miles from the nearest house. Clutching her robe around her, she approached the door and opened it a crack. No one was there. The cold night air seeped in, carrying with it the scent of pine and something faintly metallic. She stepped out onto the porch, scanning the dark woods, but there was only silence. Shivering, she went back inside and bolted the door. As she turned away, she thought she saw movement through the window, a ripple across the surface of the lake, though the wind had stilled. Evelyn froze, staring into the blackness, but whatever she thought she saw was gone. Over the next few days, Evelyn felt the lake's presence in a way she couldn't explain. At night, she dreamed of its depths, vast, unending, and filled with shadowy forms that moved too quickly to discern. During the day, she found herself drawn to its edge, where the silence seemed heavier, as though the world were holding its breath. One morning, she decided to walk the perimeter of the lake. The forest was dense, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. As she walked, she noticed strange markings carved into the trees, symbols she didn't recognize. They were crude, almost primitive, and as she ran her fingers over one, she felt a sudden jolt like static electricity. The sensation left her uneasy, but she pressed on. About halfway around the lake, she stumbled upon a small clearing where the ground was covered in bones. Some were animal, others disturbingly human-like. She backed away, her breath quickening, and hurried back to the cabin. That night, the knocking returned. Evelyn didn't answer the door this time. She stayed by the window, peering out into the darkness. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to echo through the entire cabin. And then it stopped. She stayed awake until dawn, clutching a kitchen knife and jumping at every creak of the cabin's old timbers. When morning came, she found muddy footprints on the porch, bare, human footprints leading away toward the lake. Over the next few days, Evelyn's sanity began to unravel. She heard whispers in the wind, her name carried faintly through the trees. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, and the lake seemed to pulse, its surface rippling in ways that defied the stillness of the air. On the fifth night, she was awoken by a sound she couldn't ignore, a low, resonant hum that seemed to come from beneath the cabin. She grabbed her flashlight and followed the noise to the cellar. The air grew colder as she descended the wooden stairs, and the hum grew louder, more alive. In the center of the cellar floor was a trapdoor she had never noticed before. It was ancient, its wood rotting and etched with the same symbols she had seen in the forest. Against every instinct, she opened it. Beneath the trapdoor was a tunnel, the walls slick with moisture and pulsing faintly, as if alive. Evelyn climbed down, the hum now a deafening roar that vibrated through her bones. The tunnel led to a cavern that opened out beneath the lake. The water above was translucent, a shifting veil that separated her from the surface. In the center of the cavern stood a stone altar, and on it was a figure, human-like but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its face too smooth, and its eyes were empty voids that seemed to pull the light from the room. The figure turned to her, its mouth stretching into a grotesque approximation of a smile. "Welcome," it said, its voice a guttural echo that filled the cavern. "We have been waiting." The next morning, the cabin was empty. Evelyn was gone, her belongings left behind, as though she had simply vanished. The locals whispered about Blackwater Hollow, about the warnings she had ignored, and about the lake that always seemed just a little darker, a little deeper than it had been before. But no one dared to go near it. Not anymore. Wires and Chains Part 6. She let out a shriek, a piercing, bone-rattling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. For a moment, none of us moved, frozen in the grip of pure terror. We turned around to head back. The retreat back to the gorge was hurried, the weight of what we'd seen hanging over all of us. Mama Webster's monstrous form, the sight of her descending from the cliffs, had left an indelible mark on every one of us. Her grotesque presence, even for just a moment, was a reminder of what we were truly up against. "This isn't the way forward," I said, my voice sharp as we approached the bridge. The soldiers lingered just ahead, their eyes darting nervously at every shadow. "We can't get an army through here. It's too dangerous. We need another way." Gregory turned, his expression grim. "Agreed. This path is suicide. Let's regroup and come up with something else." Chiana was already scanning the cliffs above, her bow drawn and ready. "Move fast. She's still out there." The bridge came into view, swaying gently in the faint breeze. It felt different now, less a route forward and more a fragile, fleeting link to safety. Every creak of the wood sent a fresh wave of anxiety through me. "Go," Gregory said, waving the soldiers forward. "One at a time. Don't rush it." The soldiers began crossing, their movements careful and deliberate, the ropes groaning faintly under their weight. Gregory and Tiana stayed at my sides, their weapons drawn. The stillness of the gorge was deafening, the faint rustling of the wind barely audible. And then the clicking began. It started faintly, like before, a sound so soft it could have been a trick of the mind. But as it grew louder, faster, and closer, the sense of dread returned with full force. "She's here," Tiana said, her voice tight. The clicking echoed from above and around us, impossible to track. The soldiers on the bridge froze, their eyes wide as the sound reverberated through the gorge. "Move," I shouted, waving them forward. They scrambled to obey, their boots clattering against the wooden planks as the bridge swayed dangerously. Tiana loosed an arrow into the shadows above, but it was impossible to tell if it hit anything. Then she appeared. Mama Webster surged over the cliffs, her massive form blotting out the light. Her legs moved with impossible speed, their sharp tips slamming into the stone path as she scuttled toward us. Her body glistened with oil-like fur, and her many eyes gleamed with a cold, predatory hunger. She let out a piercing shriek that seemed to shake the air itself, the sound rattling my teeth and sending a jolt of terror through me. "Run," Gregory shouted, grabbing my arm and shoving me toward the bridge. I stumbled onto the planks, the structure swaying violently beneath my feet. The soldiers were nearly across, their frantic movements setting the ropes creaking. Tiana turned, firing arrow after arrow at the monstrous creature, but they barely slowed her down. Mama Webster's legs struck the bridge as she lunged, her weight causing the planks to groan and splinter. I reached the middle, Gregory and Tiana close behind, but I could feel her closing in. One of her legs slammed down inches from me, the force sending me sprawling onto the planks. I scrambled to my feet, but she was already upon us, her massive form blocking the path ahead. She lunged, her mandibles snapping inches from my face. I raised my weapon, but her legs struck me hard, knocking me onto my back. I stared up at her, my chest heaving as I struggled to move. Her eyes, dozens of them, locked onto mine, cold and calculating. Her mandibles clicked, and for a moment, I thought I saw something in her movements, something eerily human. Was she like me? The thought came unbidden, sending a chill through me. Had Mama Webster once been a player, someone like me who had died in this world, and been rewoven into one of Nama's monstrous creations? The idea made my stomach churn, but there was no time to dwell on it. She reared back, her massive legs pinning me down as she prepared to strike. And then Gregory moved. With a roar, he leaped onto her back, his sword slashing into the thick fur of her thorax. She shrieked, twisting violently, but he held on, his weight throwing her balance off. "Gregory!" Tiana screamed, her voice filled with panic. He didn't hesitate. With a final, desperate movement, he drove his blade deeper and pulled with all his strength, dragging her weight toward the edge of the bridge. Mama Webster screeched, her legs flailing as she scrabbled for purchase. The ropes creaked and groaned under her immense weight, but Gregory didn't stop. With one last, tremendous heave, he pulled her over the edge. There was no time for words, no final goodbyes. Gregory and Mama Webster disappeared into the darkness below, their forms swallowed by the abyss. The sound of their fall echoed faintly, then silence. I lay there, staring at the edge of the bridge, my chest tight, and my breath shallow. Tiana stood frozen, her bow slack in her hands, tears streaking down her cheeks. "Glenn," she said finally, her voice trembling, "we have to move." I nodded numbly, forcing myself to my feet. We crossed the bridge in silence, the creaking planks beneath my boots a cruel reminder of what had just happened. When we reached the other side, I turned back, staring into the void where Gregory had fallen. I didn't say anything. There were no words, just a hollow, gnawing ache that I knew I'd carry with me for the rest of this journey. We pressed on, because there was nothing else we could do. The days following our retreat from the gorge blurred together, an endless stretch of exhaustion, grief, and grim determination. With no way forward through the gorge and Gregory gone, we had no choice but to loop back to the army and search for another path. It took weeks to navigate the winding trails and treacherous terrain that led us around the gorge. The terrain seemed to grow more twisted and foreboding with each passing day, as if the land itself conspired to keep us from our goal. The soldiers, now bound to a deeper purpose by the tune of my pipes, marched with a resilience that bordered on eerie. Tiana and I kept to ourselves, our shared grief over Gregory's sacrifice hanging between us like a shadow. The nights were the hardest. The campfires brought little comfort, the flickering flames casting shadows that danced too much like monsters. Every gust of wind, every crack of a branch sent our nerves spiraling. I couldn't shake the feeling that Nama was watching, her unseen presence weighing heavy on my mind. But we pressed on, because there was no other choice. Eventually, the land began to change again. The jagged cliffs gave way to smoother plains, and the oppressive canopy of the forest thinned, letting in faint streams of light. The air was different here, heavier with a strange, cloying sweetness that clung to every breath. And then, one morning, we saw it. Namis Palace. It loomed on the horizon like a dark crown, its towering spires piercing the sky. The gates were immense, wrought from black iron, and adorned with intricate carvings of writhing figures, their twisted forms both beautiful and grotesque. The walls shimmered faintly, as though they were made of liquid shadow, and the air around the palace seemed to hum with an otherworldly energy. The army stopped in their tracks, the soldiers murmuring uneasily as they took in the sight. Even Tiana, who had been so composed, seemed shaken by the sheer presence of the palace. "It's massive," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my jaw tightening as I stared up at the gates. "This is it," I said, more to myself than anyone else. The weight of Gregory's absence hit me again as I stood there, his sacrifice fresh in my mind. He had given everything to get us here, and now it was up to us to finish what we'd started. Tiana stepped closer, her expression hardening as she placed a hand on my shoulder. "He wouldn't want us to stop now," she said, as if reading my thoughts. I took a deep breath, the pipes in my hand feeling heavier than ever. "No," I said quietly. "He wouldn't." I turned to the soldiers, their eyes fixed on me, waiting for their next command. "Prepare yourselves," I said, my voice steady despite the unease twisting in my gut. "This isn't just a palace. It's her domain, and she won't let us in without a fight." The army moved into formation, their discipline unnerving in its precision. Tiana and I exchanged a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the battle ahead. As the gates of Namis Palace loomed closer, the oppressive hum in the air grew louder, resonating deep in my chest. The assault began at dawn. The soldiers moved as one, their polished armor glinting in the faint light of the rising sun. The air was heavy with tension, thick with the unspoken understanding that this battle would be unlike anything we had ever faced. Tiana stood beside me, her bow drawn, her sharp gaze fixed on the towering gates of Namis Palace. As we approached, the oppressive hum in the air intensified, vibrating deep in my chest. The walls of the palace seemed to shimmer with a dark, liquid energy, their surface alive with faint, writhing shapes that defied understanding. The army reached the gates, and the first wave of soldiers surged forward, carrying a massive battering ram. The crash of wood against iron echoed through the courtyard, each strike reverberating like a thunderclap. Monsters poured out of the shadows. They came in waves, grotesque and twisted, their forms defying logic. Some were massive, towering beasts with limbs that bent unnaturally, their flesh covered in pulsating, black veins. Others were smaller, faster, their razor-sharp claws and jagged teeth gleaming in the dim light. The soldiers held their ground, their movements precise and unrelenting as they engaged the horde. For every monster they struck down, two more seemed to take its place. The air was filled with the clash of steel, the guttural roars of the creatures, and the cries of men fighting for their lives. Tiana loosed arrow after arrow, each shot finding its mark. I stayed close, my blade cutting through the chaos as we pushed forward, step by bloody step. And then, with a deafening crack, the gates shattered. The soldiers surged through, spilling into the courtyard beyond. For a moment, it seemed like we had the upper hand. The monsters faltered, their ranks thinning as we pushed them back toward the palace walls. But it was a trap. The walls shimmered, the shadows twisting and stretching until they burst forth with a new wave of horrors. These were different, more deliberate, more calculated. Their grotesque forms moved with an intelligence that sent a chill down my spine. The ambush hit the army hard. Soldiers were dragged into the shadows, their screams cutting short as the monsters overwhelmed them. The courtyard became a bloodbath, the once coordinated ranks of my army breaking apart under the relentless assault. "Keep moving," Tiana shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me forward. We fought through the chaos, the pikes heavy at my side as I slashed and ducked, every step closer to the main entry of the palace. The air was suffocating now, thick with the acrid stench of blood and decay. As we neared the massive doors that led into the palace itself, the battle seemed to fade into the background. The noise dulled, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on my chest. And then they dropped. 3 figures descended from the walls above, landing with a thunderous crash that shook the ground beneath us. The first was a hulking monstrosity, its body a grotesque blend of muscle and metal, its face twisted into a mockery of humanity. Its eyes gleamed with a cold, unfeeling light, and its movements were deliberate, almost purposeful. Henry. I froze, my mind struggling to reconcile the monstrous form before me with the man I had once known. His features were warped, his body reshaped into something unrecognizable, but there was no mistaking the presence that radiated from him. The second was smaller, its grotesque frame twitching with an unnatural energy. Its skin was pale and sickly, its limbs elongated and ending in razor-sharp claws. Its face was a twisted parody of youth, its mouth stretched into a jagged grin that didn't reach its cold, lifeless eyes. Skibidi. A sickening realization churned in my stomach as I remembered his childish bravado, his insistence on being a warlord. Now he was a nightmare given form, a mockery of the boy he once was. The third monster stepped forward, and my breath caught in my throat. It was massive, its lower body a grotesque, spider-like form that clattered on the stone with a horrifying rhythm. Its upper body was humanoid, but only barely. Its arms were long and segmented, ending in jagged, chitinous blades. Its face. "Gregory," I whispered, my voice trembling. The monstrous form before me had his eyes, or at least what was left of them. They glinted with a cruel intelligence, the twisted remains of the man who had sacrificed himself for us now standing as Nama's weapon. Tiana gasped, her bow faltering as she took a step back. "No," she breathed, her voice filled with disbelief. The 3 horrors stood in silence for a moment, their presence suffocating. Then, as one, they moved. Henry charged forward, his massive frame barreling toward us like a living battering ram. Skibidi scuttled along the walls, his claws scraping against the stone with an ear-piercing screech. Gregory circled, his spider legs clattering as he closed in with deliberate menace. "Glenn," Tiana shouted, snapping me out of my stupor. I raised my blade, the weight of the moment crashing down on me. These weren't just monsters. They were ghosts, twisted remnants of the people I had failed to save. And now, they were coming for me. The fight began with a fury that felt doomed from the start. Henry roared, his massive form charging forward with terrifying speed. Tiana loosed arrow after arrow, each one striking true, but barely slowing him down. I met his charge head-on, my blade clashing against the grotesque, metallic monstrosity of his limbs. Each strike sent vibrations through my arms, the sheer power of his attacks overwhelming. "Glenn, move," Tiana shouted as Skibidi leaped from the wall, his claws slashing down at me. I barely ducked in time, the air hissing as his claws tore through the space where my head had been. Gregory's spider-like form clattered toward Tiana, his long, segmented legs moving with horrifying precision. She dodged one strike, then another, her movements frantic as she tried to find an opening to shoot. "They're too fast," she yelled, her voice strained. I slashed at Henry, but his thick, grotesque armor absorbed the blow. He swung at me with a fist the size of a boulder, and I barely managed to roll out of the way as the ground where it had been standing cracked under the impact. Skibidi skittered around me, his movements erratic and unnerving. He lunged, his claws catching the edge of my armor and dragging me off balance. I stumbled, falling to one knee, and felt the cold rush of air as Gregory's bladed arm came down toward me. "Glenn," Tiana screamed, tackling me out of the way. The blade struck the ground with a deafening clang, sending shards of stone flying. I scrambled to my feet, my chest heaving as I tried to keep up with their relentless assault. My mind raced, searching for any strategy, any hope of turning the tide. But they were faster, stronger, and terrifyingly coordinated. Henry swung his massive arm, and this time it connected. The blow sent me flying, my back slamming into the stone wall of the courtyard. Stars exploded in my vision as pain shot through me, my weapon slipping from my grasp. I blinked, trying to focus, and saw them closing in. Henry advancing with his hulking frame, Skibidi scuttling with twitching anticipation, Gregory towering above them all with an eerie, deliberate grace. Tiana was struggling too, her arrows running low as she dodged and weaved, trying to keep them at bay. It was hopeless. But then, in the chaos, I saw it. A gap between the horrors, a narrow path that led to the palace doors. The thought hit me like a bolt of lightning. If I can just make it inside. Tiana, I shouted, pushing myself to my feet. Cover me. What are you? Just do it. She hesitated for only a second before turning her focus to the monsters. With a shout, she fired an arrow that struck Henry square in the chest, drawing his attention away from me. I ran. My legs felt like lead, every step a battle against the pain coursing through my body. The monsters reacted immediately. Skibidi shrieked, his claws scraping against the stone as he lunged toward me. Gregory shifted, his spider legs clattering as he moved to block my path. But Tiana was there, her arrows flying in rapid succession, each one finding its mark. It wasn't enough to stop them, but it was enough to slow them down. I reached the doors, my breath ragged as I slammed into the massive ornate surface. They creaked under my weight, but didn't budge. Come on, I growled, throwing all my strength into it. Behind me, I heard Tiana cry out, a sharp, desperate sound that made my stomach drop. Glenn, she shouted, her voice filled with panic. I glanced over my shoulder and saw her on the ground, her bow broken, Henry towering over her. Gregory was advancing, his bladed arms raised, and Skibidi was already closing the distance to me. Panic surged through me as I turned back to the doors, shoving against them with everything I had. With a groan, they gave way, swinging open just enough for me to slip through. I stumbled inside, the heavy doors slamming shut behind me with a deafening thud. To be continued. Never call a number scratched into a bathroom stall. The dive bar bathroom smelled like a mix of beer-soaked wood and overused cleaning chemicals that couldn't quite mask the underlying stench. I leaned against the chipped sink, scrolling through my phone, killing time while waiting for my turn to use the stall. That's when I noticed it. It was scratched into the wall beside the mirror in jagged, uneven letters. People Knob, followed by a phone number. The handwriting was chaotic, like it had been carved in a hurry, but the words were oddly precise. I chuckled under my breath. Drunken graffiti was a staple of places like this, but this one had a strange charm. I snapped a picture of it and sent it to the group chat I had with my friends, captioning it, "Found some quality poetry tonight." The replies were instant. What does it even mean? Drunk people are wild. Bet it's a sex line. Call it Peter. I laughed and tucked my phone back in my pocket. Yeah, no thanks. I had no interest in whatever prank or scam waited on the other end of that number. It was probably a hotline for weirdos who got off on creeping out random people. When I finally got home later that night, I looked at the picture again. People Knob. What a bizarre phrase. Who even thinks to write something like that? Asterisk, 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 asterisk. A week later, I saw it again. This time, it was at a trendy cafe downtown. I was washing my hands in their sleek, modern bathroom, the kind with motion sensor everything, when I spotted it etched faintly into the metal edge of the paper towel dispenser. The same sloppy handwriting and the same phone number. I froze, staring at it. The déjà vu hit me hard. My brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe the same prankster had been here. Maybe it was some urban scavenger hunt or guerrilla marketing campaign. But why People Knob? It wasn't clever or catchy. It was just weird. I shook it off and returned to my table, but the encounter stuck with me. Over the next week, I saw the phrase in more places: a park bench near my office, a bus stop on my commute, once even scratched faintly into the wood of a restaurant booth where I was having dinner with coworkers. The graffiti definitely wasn't confined to seedy places, and it was spreading. At first, I ignored it. That is, until I started to feel like it was following me. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. 2 weeks after my first encounter, I decided to give in to curiosity. I was at home, scrolling through my photos, when I came across the picture I'd taken in the dive bar. My thumb hovered over the phone number. Rationally, I knew better. Calling random numbers scrawled on bathroom walls wasn't something normal people did. But the sheer repetition of it had me on edge. What was it? A joke? A secret? Or something else entirely? I reasoned with myself that it was probably some bored teenager having fun. I'd call, laugh at the nonsense, and put this whole thing to rest. Before I could second-guess myself, I hit the call button. The line connected, but no one spoke. For a moment, there was nothing but silence, and then there were sounds. Sloshing, gurgling, wet, visceral noises that made my skin crawl. I blinked, confused. Was it a bad connection? Some kind of strange audio file? I'd hardly had time to consider all the possibilities when, faintly, in the background, I heard what sounded like muffled screaming. My stomach turned. I gripped the phone tighter, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The sounds weren't static. They were deliberate and organic. Whatever was happening on the other end of the line was deeply wrong and sounded very, very real. "Hello," I said, my voice cracking slightly. No answer, just the wet, squelching noises and tortured screams. I hung up, my heart racing. For a few minutes, I just sat there, staring at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. Maybe it was a prank, some kind of sick joke. But the screams, they sounded genuine. I tried not to think about it. I shoved my phone into my pocket, turned on the TV, and drowned the memory in sitcom reruns. I barely had time to relax when my phone buzzed, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. I peered at my screen and swallowed hard. I gasped when I realized it was the same number, the one I had just called, and it was calling me back. Against my better judgment, I answered, my hands trembling slightly. The same noises poured into my ear, slurping and squelching. And now, accompanying it, a bizarre mechanical whirring. It sounded something like a grinder or a machine chewing through something. Beyond the din, I heard more screaming, this time louder and more desperate. "Who is this?" I shouted, panic overtaking me. I received no response, but it was clear now that someone on the other line was listening. I could hear them breathing, heavy, labored inhalations that filled the silence between the grotesque sounds. I couldn't take it anymore. "I'm calling the police, you sick freak," I yelled, smashing the end call button. I blocked the number and tossed the phone onto the couch. That night, for the first time in years, I double-checked that all my doors and windows were locked. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. I didn't sleep. Even after making sure that the locks on my doors and windows were functional, I didn't feel safe. Instead, I felt like I was being watched. I had no reason to believe that the owner of the number knew where I lived, and yet I couldn't relax. The call had rattled me more than I wanted to admit. Those sounds, wet, organic, and punctuated by screaming, played on repeat in my mind. I told myself again, was a harmless prank meant to freak me out, but my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, still groggy from lack of sleep, I decided to report the calls. It felt ridiculous walking into the police station to explain what had happened, but it seemed like the right thing to do, under the circumstances. I'd spent the drive there rehearsing what I'd say, trying to make it sound as normal as possible. The desk officer looked unimpressed as I laid it all out. "You called a number scratched on a bathroom wall, and they made noises at you." He quirked an eyebrow. I cleared my throat. It wasn't just noises. It sounded like someone was screaming. And there was this machine sound. It wasn't normal. The officer leaned back in his chair, stifling a yawn. Look, unless they threatened you or you've got proof of a crime, there's not much we can do. Probably just some pervert having a laugh. Block the number and move on. I felt a spark of irritation flare. So if this person is hurting someone, like the screaming I heard, you're just going to ignore it. He gave me a look that said he was done humoring me. We get weird calls reported all the time. If it happens again, record it and bring that in. But for now, I suggest you let it go. I walked out of the station, fuming. Let it go. Sure, I just forget the horrifying sounds and the way my stomach dropped when the number called back. The cops clearly weren't going to help. That night, my friends and I decided to hit up a new bar downtown. I figured a few drinks and some good company would be enough to distract me from the unsettling events of the past few days. By the time we arrived, I was already a couple of beers in, feeling the edge of my anxiety dull. The place was crowded and lively, with dim lighting and music loud enough to vibrate the walls. My friends and I grabbed a corner booth, ordering drinks and shouting over the noise to catch up on everyone's week. Still freaked out about that creepy phone call? My friend Kyle asked, leaning across the table. I shrugged, not wanting to get into it. Blocked the number. Haven't heard anything since. See, he said with a grin. Problem solved. You just gotta quit being such a magnet for weird stuff. I forced a laugh, but my unease lingered. After a while, the drinks caught up to me, and I excused myself to find the bathroom. The hallway leading there was narrow and lined with framed vintage posters. The bathroom itself was what you'd expect. Grimy tile, flickering fluorescent lights, and a stall door that didn't quite close all the way. I stepped into the stall and sighed, leaning against the wall as I did my business. That's when I heard it. Someone entered the stall next to mine, their footsteps heavy. There was something unusual about the way they moved, accompanied by a dragging sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Then came the noises, wet, slurping sounds, like someone sucking the marrow from a bone. My chest tightened as I recognized the sounds from the phone calls. What were the odds? I froze, straining to hear. I had to be sure. As I listened, the noises grew louder and more grotesque. A faint, rhythmic gulping, like something viscous being stirred and then swallowed. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced with panic, screaming at me to get out. I zipped up and stumbled out of the stall, barely registering the flickering lights overhead. I burst back into the main bar area, overwhelmed by the urge to flee the building. I didn't care if I sounded insane. Guys, I said, grabbing Kyle's arm. Someone's in the bathroom. It's the same thing from the calls. My friends exchanged glances, clearly skeptical. What are you talking about? Kyle asked, frowning. I'm not joking. I hissed. Just come look. They followed me, laughing nervously as we made our way back to the bathroom. I pushed open the door, fully expecting to see someone, or something, waiting inside. It was empty. The bathroom was empty. There were no dragging footsteps and no wet noises, just the faint hum of flickering fluorescent lights. And me, looking like an absolute fool. My friends groaned in frustration. Dude, you've had way too much to drink, Kyle said, shaking his head. Wait, I said, pointing to the stall I'd been in. The words "People Knob" were freshly etched into the metal door, the jagged letters standing out starkly against the smoothly polished surface. What the hell? One of my friends muttered, leaning in for a closer look. Kyle snorted. So someone's been tagging bathrooms. Big deal. It wasn't here when I walked in. I snapped, my voice rising. I swear to God, something's going on. Kyle rolled his eyes. Fine. Let's see how funny this pervert thinks they are. He whipped out his phone and dialed the number before I could stop him. No, what are you doing, Kyle? I shouted. Are you crazy? I grabbed for his phone, but he held it out of reach. You don't get it. Now they'll have your number too. Kyle laughed. Relax, man. They're probably some loser living in their mom's basement. I'll give him a piece of my mind. He held the phone to his ear. A moment later, we heard the line connect, and then his grin faded. His expression shifted from amused to confused, then to something else entirely. Fear. What is it, Kyle? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. His voice was barely a whisper. They want to talk to you, Peter. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. I didn't speak to Kyle for the rest of the night. I barely even said goodbye to my friends as I bolted out of the bar. The words, "They want to talk to you," played on a loop in my head, growing louder with each repetition until I felt like my skull would split. The streets blurred past me as I power walked toward home, sweat slicking my palms. The city lights offered no comfort. Each shadow, every passing stranger, felt sinister. When I reached my apartment building, I froze at the sight of my door. It was ajar. I stood there for a moment, rooted in place. Had I forgotten to lock it? No, I remembered doing it before I left. My gut twisted as I opened the door, wincing at the creak of the hinges. The living room looked normal, too normal. My laptop was still on the coffee table, the half-empty bag of chips from earlier in the day untouched. Nothing seemed out of place, and yet the air felt heavy. Grabbing the largest kitchen knife I owned, I began a slow, deliberate sweep of the apartment. My breath caught in my throat as I checked the closets, under the bed, and behind the shower curtain. Everything was as it should be. Everything, that is, except the bathroom. When I turned the light on, I nearly dropped the knife. There it was, asterisk people knob. Asterisk scratched into the tile above the sink. The same message that had haunted me for days. The jagged letters glared back at me, meticulously scrawled in identical handwriting. I stumbled back. This wasn't just a prank. Someone had been in my apartment, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't waste another second. I bolted out of the building, knife still in hand, and called my best friend, Jake, begging to crash on his couch for the night. Jake didn't ask many questions. He'd always been the kind of guy who didn't pry, which was one of the reasons I trusted him. I gave him the short version. Someone had broken into my apartment and left a creepy message. He nodded grimly, offering me a blanket and a beer. The next morning, after calling my landlord and leaving them a voicemail explaining why I was leaving, I packed a bag and drove to my parents' house. I couldn't face going back to the apartment, not yet. My mom fussed over me the way she always did, offering coffee and concerned questions. My dad was quieter, his frown deep and contemplative as I explained the situation. "This some kind of stalker, you think?" he asked finally. "I don't know," I replied. The police didn't take it seriously the first time, and now I trailed off, unsure of how to explain the gravity of what had happened. My parents did their best to make me feel secure. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe again. The isolation of the house, the way it sat back from the road, surrounded by tall trees, felt like a buffer between me and whatever was happening. By the second night, I even managed to sleep. The illusion of safety didn't last. It was my mom's cell phone that rang first. We were sitting in the kitchen, sipping coffee and talking about mundane things, when she picked it up. Her face clouded with confusion as she looked at the screen. "It's for you," she said, holding the phone out to me. I stared at her, my blood turning to ice. "What do you mean, it's for me?" "I don't know," she said, frowning. "I just feel like it's meant for you." My hand shook as I took the phone from her. "Hello." The line was silent for a moment. Then the familiar noises began. Slurping, squelching, and the faint hum of a machine grinding in the background. Farther back, quiet but still audible, were the muffled screams. I hung up immediately, my chest heaving. The phone dropped from my hand onto the kitchen table. "What is it?" my mom asked, alarmed. "It's them," I whispered. They followed me here. After that, I knew I couldn't stay at my parents' house any longer. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop. It didn't matter where I went, asterisk, and the last thing I wanted was for my parents to get involved. Or worse, hurt. My landlord called me back the next day, promising to change the locks and install security cameras. The police assured me they'd patrol the area. Reluctantly, I agreed to return to the apartment. When I arrived, the building seemed quieter than usual. My neighbors' doors were all shut tight, and the hallways were silent except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. I unlocked the door, half expecting the graffiti to still be on the bathroom wall. But everything looked pristine. The landlord had done a thorough job cleaning up. I spotted several new cameras on the way in. Everything looked good so far. I let out a shaky breath and dropped my bag onto the couch. For the first time in days, I felt a sliver of hope. Maybe it was over. Maybe I could start piecing my life back together. Then I noticed a voicemail notification on my phone. It was from my landlord, time-stamped about 30 minutes before I arrived. Somehow I had missed it. I pressed play, holding the phone to my ear. "Peter, it's Jim," the message began, his voice trembling. "Listen, I was reviewing the security footage from the night of the break-in, and look, I don't know how to say this, but whatever went into your apartment that night, it never left. It's still in there. I'm on my way with the police. Don't go inside. Whatever you do, don't." The message cut off. I stood there, frozen. Jim's message hadn't even had time to register yet by the time a sound reached me from the bedroom. It was faint at first, but as I listened, it grew louder. A wet, scraping noise, punctuated by the rhythmic thud of heavy footsteps. They were getting closer. I didn't even grab my bag. I bolted out the door and sprinted down the street. I didn't stop running until I was blocks away and my legs gave out. My lungs felt as if they were on fire by the time I collapsed on a bench near a 24-hour diner. I gulped down air, glancing over my shoulder like a hunted animal. Every shadow on the sidewalk, every car passing by, felt like a threat. Jim's voicemail replayed in my mind, his panicked words echoing over the sound of those dragging footsteps. Whatever went into my apartment that night, it never left. I never went back to my apartment again. By the time my landlord and the police arrived, I was already gone, sitting in Jake's living room, shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. Jake didn't interrupt. And for once, he didn't even crack a joke. When I finished, he sat in stunned silence. "Man, you're not going back there, are you?" he finally asked. I shook my head vehemently. "No, I'm done. I'm not going back, not when he knows where I live." And I meant it. Whatever I left behind, clothes, furniture, even my laptop, it wasn't worth my trouble or my life. Jake offered to let me crash at his place for a while, but I knew that wasn't an option. I didn't want whatever it was to follow me there too. I spent the next week at a cheap motel on the edge of town, paying in cash and keeping my phone turned off except to check for updates from the landlord and the cops. Each night, I triple-checked the locks on the door and windows, slept with the lights on, and tucked a knife under my pillow. The landlord called twice. The first time, he left a voicemail saying the apartment was empty when they arrived. According to him, there was no sign of forced entry. No signs of anyone, or anything, inside. I couldn't help but scoff. The second time, he didn't leave a message. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. I left town the following weekend. I packed what little I could fit into my car and drove until the city was a distant memory. I settled in a small town a few states away, a quiet place where nobody knew my name. I found a job at a local hardware store and rented a modest room above an elderly couple's garage. For a while, I began to believe I could move on. Unfortunately, as it turns out, the damage was already done. I still see it sometimes, not the thing itself, thank God, but the aftermath. Little signs that remind me that it's still out there. A phrase scrawled on a wall in an unfamiliar handwriting. A phone number scratched into the edge of a table at a diner. Once, I swore I caught a glimpse of the words "People Knob" on a sticky note stuck to the inside of a bus shelter. I never take the bus anymore. Perhaps I'm just lucky, but the calls have stopped. I changed my number, disconnected my old phone, and started over with a new device. And so far, I've managed to avoid any strange voicemails or late-night calls. The fear, however, still lingers. The nightmares are the worst. In them, I'm back in my old apartment. The walls are covered in the words "People Knob," carved so deeply that the plaster is flaking off. Wet, gurgling sounds fill the air, punctuated by agonized screams that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In the dream, I know I should run, but my legs refuse to move. Something approaches me. Its footsteps slow and deliberate, dragging heavily across the floor. I always wake up before I see it. I don't talk about it much anymore. Jake's the only person who knows the full story, and even he avoids bringing it up. It's easier that way, pretending like it never happened. But sometimes, when I see jagged handwriting etched into a random bathroom stall or a graffiti-covered wall, I wonder how many other people have called the number, that number. And I wonder how many others got out alive. The curse of my family. It's a strange way to start a story, I know. Something for kids, right? But the truth is, over time, some memories gain weight. And my memories from that time, well, I can't guarantee I understood everything I saw. Back then, my uncle used to say there were things in this world that shouldn't be seen. I'd laugh, thinking it was just another one of his scary stories to spook us kids. But on a warm full moon night, out on the ranch, I learned not all stories come from imagination. It was the first time I'd heard the ranch dogs bark like that, like they'd seen the devil himself. The cattle were restless, mooing into the dark early hours, and a chill ran down my spine. My uncle appeared in the kitchen, rifle in hand, his face marked by a fear I'd never seen before. "Stay inside, and if someone knocks on the door, don't open it," he said firmly. I didn't even ask what was going on. He looked too serious, almost sweating. He walked out, disappearing into the brush, the glow of his flashlight swaying in the darkness. And I stayed behind, alone, every noise outside taking on a different weight, every second stretching longer than the last. It wasn't long before I heard a scream coming from the woods, but it wasn't the scream of any animal I knew. It was something between a wail and a human voice, distorted and loud, like a massive mouth trying to speak. The moment I heard it, a chill ran down my back, and I wanted to run. But instead, I froze, eyes locked on the closed door. My aunt, who'd been in the bedroom, rushed into the kitchen. She didn't say a word, just grabbed my hand and looked at me with a terror I'd never seen before. Occasionally, she murmured under her breath, clutching a crucifix. We stayed there, in the dark, just listening to the night, the sounds of the struggle outside, and those terrible screams. When the sounds finally stopped, the silence was so absolute it was even scarier. After a few minutes, my uncle came in. He was covered in scratches and blood, though he didn't seem hurt. His hand shook as he set the rifle down and looked at my aunt, like he wanted to say something but couldn't. I stared at him, waiting for him to tell us what he'd seen, but he just shook his head and said, "It's gone." In the days that followed, everything seemed to return to normal. My uncle didn't talk about what happened that night, and my aunt only gave me silent glances, as if we were all wrapped in some dark secret none of us wanted to admit. But I knew something had changed. There was a strange tension in the air, and even the animals seemed more nervous, always on edge. Then, one early morning, when everything was quiet, the screams began again, a high, drawn-out sound that cut through the dark like a warning. This time, I knew it was closer. It felt like the sound was coming from inside the ranch itself. The dogs, who usually barked, now only whimpered, as if they knew there was nothing to be done. My heart raced, and I could barely breathe. I looked out the window and saw my uncle was already outside, rifle in hand. He seemed to be waiting for something. For a moment, I thought he looked directly at me, but then he turned away. He looked like he was making a decision. When he raised his flashlight, the beam cut across the field, and for a second, I saw it, a grotesque, deformed silhouette moving in a way no animal ever would. It wasn't an animal or a human. It was like the creature was made of mismatched parts, something that shouldn't exist. And its eyes, they glowed brightly, reflecting the light of the flashlight like two embers in the dark. The creature stood still, just watching. My uncle shouted something, an attempt to scare it off, but it didn't seem afraid. After a few seconds, it turned and slowly disappeared into the darkness. The next morning, I found my uncle in the kitchen, staring out at the field through the window as if he could still see the creature. I approached him and asked, with some fear, "It's going to come back, isn't it?" He didn't respond immediately, but I noticed he was holding something around his neck, a silver amulet. He sighed deeply and without looking at me said, "As long as there's a moon, it'll come back." The following nights were marked by an eerie silence. The ranch felt like a different place, as if it had been touched by a presence that was still there. My uncle stayed up all night, always near the window, rifle in hand. Years later, after he'd become a widower, he called me to spend a few days at the ranch. But to my surprise, as soon as I arrived, he told me, "It's your turn now." I froze. I looked at him, confused, not understanding what he meant. But when the full moon returned, I understood what he was trying to say. That night, I was alone. When the screams began again, I knew the cycle was restarting. And then, in the stillness of the night, I heard the most terrifying sound of all. Screams, roars, and something pounding and clawing at the door and walls of the house. The blows were strong, constant, and menacing. I thought the door wouldn't hold and would give way to the creature at any moment. It was as if it knew I was inside. When dawn broke, I went to the door and saw deep claw marks etched into the wood, terrifying and unmistakable. Since then, I've lived knowing it will return. Today, I look at my nephew sitting across from me, and I know it's time to pass on the burden. He's staring at me with a mix of disbelief and fear, but he has no idea what he's about to face. I take a deep breath, holding the silver amulet that was my uncle's, and hand it to him. "You think this is just a story, don't you? That I just want to scare you," I say, holding his gaze. He swallows hard but doesn't reply. But you'll hear those screams. And when the full moon rises and that thing starts pounding at your door, you'll understand. I pause, letting my words sink in. Remember this, kid. The cursed never have children. That's why the curse always passes to the nephews. And now it's your turn. And just like my uncle did, I start walking into the forest surrounding our ranch to meet my fate. It's the last time we'll see each other. He stares at me, speechless, his eyes wide with fear. Deep down, I know he still thinks this is just a story. But tonight, when the first scream pierces the night, he'll understand. The Beast of Berwick. Hey there, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Lime and Punishment. I'm Ricky, and joining me today as a special guest host is the woman you've all been waiting for, Jin Doe. Hi guys, Rhonda said, and that's right, Gindoe in the flesh. Do you want to tell our guests where we're recording today, Jin? I asked. I'd love to, Ricky. Rhonda swept her arms out to the sides, and Liz panned the camera around in front of her to take in the sights. For those of you not watching on YouTube, which by the way, you really should for this episode, we're here at the old Berwick ghost town. We'd opened the episode on the main strip, where you could see ye old barbershop, a saloon, and a cute little old-timey bank. Fall was the best season to visit the old Berwick ghost town. They started celebrating Halloween pretty much right after everyone finished lighting off fireworks for the 4th of July. There were jack-o'-lanterns on every doorstep along with gourds and fake spider webs scattered about. It was their peak season, and they'd roped off the entire weekend just for us. Do you want to give our listeners a little history about Berwick, or at least this version of it? I asked Rhonda. She gestured for Liz to follow her and started walking down the main strip. So this actually used to be Tombstone Town when it was first built. There wasn't much left of Berwick, and back in the 60s, true crime didn't have the draw it does now. You couldn't fill a tourist attraction based on some old murderer no one had ever heard of. So the old owners just took some of the old buildings, and the graveyard, of course, that's all original, and built up a fake little Wild West town around the bones of Berwick. Rhonda took us to look at the old graveyard, and as clouds covered the sun, I was grateful for all the layers I had on, even if I felt a bit silly in my costume. I was wearing some old tiny looking suit with a stiff collar, not too different from something you get today. Those stripes were definitely out of fashion. The fabric was cotton or wool, something that was supposed to be completely authentic. Rhonda was even more bundled up in her dress, which had not one, but two different layers underneath. It had been a huge hassle to put on. But of course, it wasn't just any dress, it was the dress. We'd agreed to film a few intros so Liz could have her pick, and of course we had to get one in the graveyard. I posed in front of a broken-off headstone and said, "Today we're covering the case you've all been requesting for years. We're going to be talking about the Beast of Berwick, the most famous serial killer this side of the Mississippi." We let Liz get some footage of the graveyard. Then Rhonda took us up to the old railroad tracks next. There was an old green locomotive with a few cars trailing behind it, and it was one of the most recognizable spots for a photo op. We stood in front for a bit to let Rhonda continue her history lesson. While only a few of the buildings were restored from Berwick itself, you can find bits and pieces of other ghost towns here. This train used to run under the famously haunted Moonville Mountain. In fact, it was the last one to pass through before the tunnel collapse. Some say the ghosts that haunted the tunnel hitched a ride on these very cars looking for a new haunt. Rhonda and I stepped inside the front car and got footage of her outfit in front of an old window. The dress was maroon with a white underlayer showing just a bit at the top of her chest. There was black embroidery near the bottom, and Rhonda had a black ribbon on her hair to match. We disturbed the dust just enough to get some nice rays of light shining in on her, making her look otherworldly, ghostly. Of course, I have to shout out the wonderful fan who made our costumes. Look up Elizabeth Stride, not that one, on Etsy. She's just amazing. Rhonda ran her hands down her sides, posing in the light again. She made this dress using all fabrics accurate to the time, and all fair trade sourced materials, of course. Rhonda paused for a minute to adjust her corset top, pulling it down a bit. My dress is an exact replica of the dress that the Beast of Berwick's third victim was killed in. It's been the subject of so much debate among true crime fans, and at any given time you can find a web sleuths or Reddit thread where people are just calling it the dress, and we all know right away what they're talking about. Rhonda paused. "Here, Liz, let's start moving to the kill room." We walked out of the train car and started making our way down the main strip once again, passing a bar with a horse's skull hung on the outside above the door. "Hang on. Let's get this before I forget," I said. I took over for this part. Right here, we got another old relic from a town you all might recognize. This skull is a fascinating little piece of history. It comes from the town of Old Straitsville, and this skull here belonged to the mayor's horse. Legend has it that the townspeople cut off his horse's head as one final warning before starting our own little chapter in the Coal Wars and unleashing a fire that's been burning for almost 200 years. I paused dramatically. Liz zoomed in on the skull, but we'll cover that in its own episode. While we had her in the outfit, we wanted to loop back to the mystery that was Jane Doe as much as possible and give Liz a few takes to work with. So we went over a slightly more detailed account of just her murder. I talked about Jane Doe as Rhonda pointed out various highlights on the poster of her dissected corpse. When they'd first opened, they'd had the spot where Jin's body was found outlined with white paint. But tourism demanded growth, and they took that out when they wanted to fill the room with more history, more memorabilia of the worst people to ever live. I wrapped up Jin Do's death once again. I talked about it and read about it dozens of times for this episode. All right, guys, that's as detailed as I'm going to get on here about how she died. I said the rest is a bit too spicy for YouTube. But let's get into the mystery of who she was and why she was the most famous victim of the Beast of Berwick. On the far wall of the morbid little museum, they had up all of the obituaries for the victims, all daughters and wives and sisters, all given an outpouring of love and grief, all except Jin, who no one knew anything about. See, in a bigger town that might not be too unusual, but Berwick, even in its heyday, only had a few hundred people. Everyone quite literally knew everyone, but no one knew Jin. Her obituary just referred to her as a mystery woman. Subsequent articles talked about how strange it was that no one had ever even seen her around town before she died. She just appeared. This led people to speculate perhaps she'd been the Beast's accomplice, that she'd snuck into town with him before he turned on her, or perhaps she'd been running from the law, laying low, only to get caught by something much worse. There were very few answers found in the 200 years since she died, only endless speculation. Jin Do had gotten her name because in her stomach they'd found only the remnants of a gin cocktail. This led people to speculate she'd been in the run as she hadn't eaten anything, or perhaps her killer gave her a drink as one final mercy. It was almost unheard of for people to be equally as enamored with the victim as with the killer. Normally, what little facts were known about the victims were said out of obligation, out of respect, to justify the level of detail given about their deaths. But Jin Do had managed to garner just as much fame as the Beast who slayed her, a rare accomplishment. I tried to switch up my wording a bit as I discussed the mystery. On the parts where I didn't have to censor myself, Liz always yelled at me for making the YouTube and audio-only recordings the same. After that, Liz had us pause so she could adjust her equipment, and Rhonda needed another smoke, so we sat on the front steps again. But this time I found myself watching the old ghost town with suspicion rather than awe. Something wasn't right. The last rays of light were nearly gone, and for the first time since I was a child, I felt some deep primal fear of the dark. I did not want it to come, but I didn't know why. I felt like we were being watched. I found myself scanning the town, trying to figure out what was wrong, and I realized it looked different. Something was off. I noticed it first with the old bank across the street. The paint on the sign had been worn and white against dark red wood, but in the twilight, it looked golden against blue and brand new. I brushed that off as just weird lighting, but the next clue was the saloon next door. As I held Rhonda close, we watched the doors start to swing outward. We looked at each other to confirm we were both seeing the same thing for only a second before looking back. The saloon doors parted slowly, then swung back like some imaginary being had walked out. Then it was noise, laughter, and talking and moans coming from where the old brothel had been reconstructed next door. My heart was racing, and I clawed at Rhonda's hand, holding it tight. A few buildings down across the street, the old bar changed as well. The horse skull was bigger now. It had regrown its flesh. It whinnied at us as something dark dripped down the newly fresh white paint behind it. We stood up and stumbled back inside, hearts racing. We slammed the door, and Liz was already frozen, listening to the sounds next door. It lasted only a second, though, before she hit record on her camera. She was a professional, after all. We huddled together close, listening in silence, not wanting to interrupt or be noticed by whatever spirits were haunting this place. But the kill room wasn't safe. Of course it wouldn't be. I watched as a scalpel on display vanished from within its case, and on the floor not far away an old shoe fell to the ground like it was dropped mid-stride from someone we couldn't see. The bare brick walls flashed white in patches as if revealing a long-lost paint job. More weapons vanished, hedge clippers and a saw gone in the blink of an eye, and a rat that I could have sworn hadn't been there before materialized under our feet and ran. In the middle of the kill room, I watched blood start to leak out from underneath the morbid displays. Then Rhonda started screaming and I held her close, but when I looked at her, her mouth was closed. She was silent and looked just as confused as I did, but the screams sounded so much like her. We heard a laugh then, quiet compared to the screams, but unmistakably a man's voice, chuckling in the dark. Liz was looking through her camera now, then looking up confused, like what was being filmed didn't match what was happening. The blood spread out further, and with it, The screams grew louder and we backed up as far as we could, but Rhonda's dress with all the frills and fabric stuck out the farthest. She looked down as the blood touched her skirt, then snapped her head up, like she was seeing something we could not. She grabbed my arm tighter and yelled, "Get away from me." The white paint on the walls spread further, and there was the smell of smoke and iron in the air. And then in the blink of an eye, Rhonda was gone. But the grip on my arm was no less tight. In her place was a teenage girl, wide-eyed and terrified. I didn't understand what I was seeing. She'd come out of nowhere. Where was Rhonda? Then the white paint receded, the smoke left the air, and the laughter next door cut off. The blood on the floor vanished. I looked at the girl then and grabbed her arm back, thinking surely that my mind was playing tricks on me. But this girl was not Rhonda. She had on a simple tan dress, her hair in a bun. She had blood dripping down her arm, and when she pulled away, my hand slipped. She broke free, slammed open the door, and ran outside. Liz reached out to me, steadying my shaky body, and said, "Where is she?" We looked around the maze of cheap display walls, but we didn't see her. Also missing were the weapons that had vanished during the strange event. Those hadn't come back, but in their place were a handful of antique tools scattered around the room. There was still that old single shoe, too, and just the far corner of the room held patches of white paint that I knew had not been there before. We looked everywhere. Then the next day, the police looked everywhere. Rhonda was gone.